Yes, please hit record. So we're going to call to, it's 6:30. We're going to call to order the Ramsey-Washington Metro Watershed District Board meeting. It's April 5th. First piece of the agenda, can we have a motion to approve the agenda? So moved. Second. And roll call.
Just a reminder, if there was anybody that wanted to pull anything from consent.
Oh, forgive me, I
That's
forgot
okay.
to ask that. Anything anyone wants to remove from the consent agenda for discussion prior?
Okay, then we're good. Roll call. So Ben.
Aye.
Mark.
Aye.
Matt. And Val.
Aye. Okay, do you mind, did we get Zoom user?
There, yep, he has the name up here now. So there are a few visitors, I believe, are here for a permit discussion, but if Dustin and Eric, if you could introduce yourself for the record.
Yep. Hi, everyone. Eric Seberg here. I work with Bolton and Mink, and I'm representing the City of Little Canada and the City of Badness Heights for a permit application.
Thanks, Eric. And Dustin?
And this is Dustin DeFelice. I'm also with Bolton and Mink, representing the city of Woodbury on the 2023 street improvements project.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so then we'll move to the consent agenda. Do I have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I move that we approve the consent agenda.
Second. Okay, discussion. Any questions on the consent agenda? Consent agenda. No. Okay, then we'll move to roll call.
Ben?
Aye.
Mark?
Aye.
Matt?
Aye.
And Val?
Aye. So next order of business is visitor comments. Eric, Dustin, I assume there are,
Permits, yeah.
yeah, they're just permits.
And then
Any
if you
other-
could introduce yourself.
I'm Bob Arthur with WSP. I'm here for item 5C if there are any questions. I think it's 5C.
The
Yes,
Hillcrest Oak.
yep. So all permit visitors today.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, if there's no visitor comments, let's move forward to permit 23-08. And does that go to Nicole?
Nicole.
Yeah, so this is a project that you got an intro for last month regarding some wetland impacts proposed in the amount of 0.03 acres or about 1,300 square feet. The board last month had some comments as well as the technical advisory panel. So bringing this back to you with the full grading permit application and questions that I had answered in the amended wetland replacement plan. So I could certainly, if the board has any questions about the mitigation methods being proposed, the alternatives or minimization efforts that were considered, we can kick off that discussion. But I should mention this is a city roadway street project near West Badness Lake. It's Twin Lakes Boulevard and it intersects in two locations with Badness Boulevard.
So I think Mark, last week you had some questions. I was curious if you had.
Yeah, I was just going to say that last month I did raise some questions regarding the methods process that had been used to evaluate potential for restoration within the district rather than going to off-site banking. And I see that that was more fully discussed. There are a couple things I had suggested that it looks like they were considered. So I think it's a small impact. I guess I'm comfortable at this point.
And I had asked, oh, I apologize. Ben, I think you had a couple of questions too. Or
Yeah, mine were more
About the
clarity
drawings.
driven on some of the drawings, and I saw those were all revised much easier to follow and helped me to see the impacts, and I'm happy with everything that's been presented.
I had I know I had some questions on water treatments, also with the buffer itself. I appreciate the notes. I was curious, and maybe this is just a point of when I read it, it wasn't clear to me. Are we maintaining the 37.5 minimum wetland buffer around the area of construction? I'm not as quick with the drawing, so I'm just curious.
Sure. So there is a figure. Sorry, I'm scrolling. So the wetland variance request memo is included, but I think the figure is a little bit more demonstrative of what we're talking about here. So the minimum buffer is 37.5 feet, and that's represented in the figure with the yellow dashed line. So you'll notice that in the existing condition, the road is actually within the minimum buffer. It's not uncommon before our rules have gone into place, and frankly, before WACA, that we would see an existing roadway or a trail so close to a wetland. So in existing conditions, the minimum buffer is not met. They are proposing to narrow the roadway, but because of the trail, you know, there's still impacts to the minimum buffer and very slight impacts to the minimum buffer with regard to the stormwater treatment. And then the 75-foot buffer is in light blue. That's the average. That extends, I mean, on the other side of the roadway. So in certain parts of the corridor, the entire road is already within the buffer. So there is a variance request enclosed for board consideration. The average buffer that they're proposing is 41 feet along the length of the wetland. They're just kind of discussing in that variance memo, sort of balancing the existing corridor and its proximity to the wetland. And then, you know, the importance of stormwater treatment. So that's definitely for the board to consider, and the variance request would be included in this permit application. Staff is recommending approval, but I could answer any other questions that you may have.
No, I did some research on buffers, and right, they're all about ensuring quality, and it seems to me that if staff moves to approve with the treatment plans that are in place, that makes sense to me. So do I have a motion to approve this permit? 2308.
So moved. Second.
Any further discussion? Okay,
We have a roll call.
roll call, please.
Ben,
Aye.
Kirk,
Aye.
Mance,
Aye.
and Beth.
Okay. Next, we are going to 2310 Oakdale Senior Living.
All right, this is a proposed senior apartment building in Oakdale. And there's an existing wetland. It's a really large parcel. It's a fairly large wetland. But they're proposing to develop a portion of the southern portion of the parcel. The wetland was delineated, and they're not proposing any impacts to the wetland itself. They are proposing temporary impacts to the upland buffer adjacent to the wetland because of grading. And so it's not considered a permanent impact because the buffer would be revegetated with a native seed mix. So if we scroll to that figure that's also included, or I guess it's within the memo of the variance request. The required buffer in this case is a 50-foot average, and they're slightly exceeding that. And then the minimum buffer is 25-foot average. They're slightly exceeding that. But so the minimum buffer would be 30 feet in the final condition.
Do you have any questions for Nicole?
Yeah, when I looked at the drawings, was not clear to me. Following grading, what the drainage plans are as far as what direction water primarily going to be going to. So if that could be addressed.
So I don't have a drainage map included on in the board packet. I usually don't, but the stormwater treatment is generally, most of it's going to the west or to the south. There's a above ground filtration basin proposed on the west end of the parcel, which is receiving impervious area runoff, and then an underground filtration system below the parking lot. So taking a lot of the parking lot. I don't know if Brandon is here. I can't really see the whole room.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Brandon and Greg Williams are both here too.
Okay. I don't know, Brandon, if you remember specifics about the drainage areas.
Excuse me, I don't have the areas, but the general drainage patterns, as you described in Nicole, are correct. The applicant is including on the south side and the southwest side of the parcel, there's some offsite drainage that is coming onto the parcel that is accounted for in their analysis. You can see in the grading plan, they do have a drainage ditch then on the southeast side of that parcel that prevents offsite runoff from entering the parcel in that area as well. So their storm sewer, on-site storm sewer will convey stormwater runoff to one of those two DMs before discharging to the north into the wetland.
So the, I'll just say it's smaller size, moderate size. I think the managed C, just to the northwest of the project footprint. That is not going to be the primary flow direction.
Correct. The flow direction is into the managed B wetland.
Yeah, that's the green one on the map.
Yeah, I have a map here. And the blue one, I guess, is the one I was curious about.
Yeah, that one is offsite. That is.
And then my last question is no impacts, no wetland impacts other than buffer are stated as such in the plan. But I found the plans not that easy to read. Kind of going back to your comment last time. There is in the construction plan, not the aerial. It shows, I'm looking for that on my computer here. It shows, it appears a new pond. I think you mentioned that, Nicole.
Mm-hmm.
And it sure looks like it's within or very near the managed B wetland. Just on the western lobe of it. So
Yeah, so I'll just clarify, the diagonal hatching is the upland buffer. So the delineated wetland is further north, and it looks like it's I don't know what you'd call that symbol, but I see what you're saying, that symbology that's butting up to the filtration basin, that's buffer.
Not
So not
wetland.
the delineated wetland.
okay,
But yeah,
that would be nice if it were clarified, but we're probably taking action tonight.
yeah, there might be a
Well, there's
legend. So
wetland
yeah,
buffer. Yeah, it's labeled as wetland buffer, and then
Yeah.
the wetland is labeled above it with the tighter hatching, I guess.
yeah, but I see your point. Like if it were included in like a legend, that would be helpful
Mhm.
versus just a label. Yeah.
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 I guess when I read the permit we're getting a lot more of these temporary disturbance permits coming through. It's it feels, and so when I start thinking about what to consider, the impact of the wetlands is a good point, Mark. That's where I was going for. Do we have a need? So any other questions or comments on this permit here? Starters. Okay, do we have a motion to approve 2310?
I would motion that we approve permit project 23.
Second.
Awesome. Roll call, please. Oh,
Any other discussion?
discussion?
Yeah.
Okay. Roll
Okay.
call, please.
Ben,
Aye.
Mark,
Aye.
Matt,
Aye.
and Val.
Aye. Okay, we move on to enforcement and action reports.
Yeah, we listed, Mary and I listed some meetings and activities that we were part of this last month. Still kind of low on the violations. Most of March was still fairly snow covered, but certainly out in more full force now with a lot of snow melt occurring on construction sites. Yeah, if there's any questions about project updates or meetings, then let me know.
I have a question on the 22-24 impact apartments in Oakdale. So you had identified that sitting water could impact the building. Was the water management not established at the time, or do you know why that pooling was there? Obviously it looks frozen to me. But curious, is that typical to happen between now and over the winter for these construction projects?
Um,
Go ahead.
I'll say that it's temporarily graded and ponding for temporary containment of water, but Mary might have more details.
Yeah, just more site-specific information. This was like an existing pond that was converted to their temp basin, but they do have inflow coming from a nearby pond. So I don't think they're expecting it to bounce quite as high as it did in the temporary state. So that's kind of what they were dealing with there.
Okay. And we're going to talk about the amount of snow later on in the session, so makes sense. I don't have any further questions. Any other questions on?
I had kind of a follow-up, which also deals with these Oakwood-Dale apartments. I don't disagree with that dewatering. It's just more of a process type thing, but when they do the dewatering, are staff present to conduct an inspection live to ensure that point source water is not contaminated or silty or anything?
Yeah, I try to be on site at least for part of the dewatering, but then I require that they submit photos of the discharge that they're producing and like label and date and time of that discharge, that they're continuously monitoring that and kind of hold them accountable and then have them report that to me.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, the MPCA is actually looking to add more specific dewatering requirements, monitoring requirements to the NPDS permit. So Mary's getting a jump start and trying to get contractors used to, like, this is what you're probably going to have to do. So yeah, I think it's good because we've seen certainly dewatering go awry where someone turns a pump on and leaves. And so I think it's good to be more actively, requiring them to monitor that.
Awesome. Any other questions? So let us move to the Hillcrest Golf Course redevelopments. Nicole, do you mind walking us through that?
Yeah, of course. So the St. Paul Port Authority is the developer on this site. Now that the golf course has been closed for a number of years, they did do a presentation about what they're generally planning as a mixed use development to the board back in December 2020, but obviously most of you weren't present for that. So I wanted to sort of loop you back in as permitting is starting to get ramped up for this redevelopment. Generally speaking, this is a now defunct golf course, over 100 acres in St. Paul. The Port Authority did purchase the property a few years ago. They've been undergoing a master planning process for years at this point with the city of St. Paul as part of their comprehensive plan. And they have found some pretty large scale soil remediation is necessary due to mercury contamination. So it's kind of a unique site in that any new use for this site would require significant soil correction. So where we're at right now, the port has submitted a grading permit application to the watershed. We're working on comments and kind of doing some back and forth related to stormwater. And then in a parallel process, the city of St. Paul is heading this wetland replacement initiative. They are the local government unit responsible for administering WACA in the city. It's our only city actually that they have elected to administer WACA themselves. So there's an open replacement plan, open for comment right now that the city has noticed. They're proposing close to an acre of temporary impact where they'd remove contaminated sediment and restore kind of as is. And then 3 acres, almost 3 acres of permanent impact. So they would be removing contaminated sediment from all over the site, not just in the wetlands, and then mitigating at a 1-to-1 ratio on site. So they'd be doing wetland creation at a scale of, that would be, you know, close to 3 acres of mitigation on site. And then they would be purchasing another approximately 3 acres in wetland bank credits. So there are a number of agencies that have weighed in on this wetland replacement plan. We did hold a TEP meeting last month to discuss the application. I do plan on submitting written comments to the city and just wanted to pull you in because eventually you're going to be seeing a grading permit application, you know, likely within the next few months. So yeah, this is an informational memo, but certainly let me know if there's any questions or concerns that you have at this time.
What's the total surface area of the changes? What acreage of the changes? Out of curiosity. So let me be more clear, project area. What's the acreage on the project area?
112.
Oh,
acres.
112 acres, yeah.
Oh, there we go. First sentence, thank you. So within that 112 acres, what prevents us from trying to replace all of the acreage that we're losing? Could you help?
They are.
They are doing 1-to-1 replacement.
Yeah.
Can you help
the
me understand the purchase of offsite banking?
Because they're required to replace at a 2-to-1. Under WACA, you're required to do
Thank you.
2-to-1 replacement
Okay,
for permanent impacts. Yeah.
so they're replacing
At
all
least
of
2-to-1 sometimes.
that. Helps me. It didn't connect honestly with the WAC rules, the 2-to-1. Well, it's like 2-to-1 at 2 points. Yeah, so the 2.8 they're replacing somewhere else on the 112, and then they're paying into offsite baking credits in addition to that.
Right.
Great, thank you. I just needed some clarity there.
Yeah, no, good question.
And Nicole, just so you know, Barth is here, and Monty, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Monty Holman, St. Paul Port Authority, Senior Vice President of Sustainable Development, and the Ports Project Lead for the Hillcrest, the Heights redevelopment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I kind of had some of the same questions as Val, but I mean, is there a reasoning why they didn't seek out to do the full 2-to-1 on site, being such a large area? Or something that prevented them with the contamination? I guess some more background would be great, because like I haven't seen this before. It's been since 2020.
Yeah. So
Be happy to give some big picture context if that's helpful for the board.
Oh, I'd love that.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Shot from here, you want me to join you up there, whatever's your preference.
I would only say that that would be welcome. I'm wondering if, because many of us were not here in 2020 when there was last a discussion about it, if it might not be a topic that you could come back with a little bit more preparation. You know, certainly give us a high level now.
Sure. Again, Monty Hillman, Senior Vice President, Sustainable Development, St. Paul Port Authority. I've been there for 17 years and work on some of the port's largest brownfield redevelopments. Mr. Kramer, good to see you again.
Yeah, you do.
We've worked together over the years. So, you know, the Port Authority bought this site for the purpose of economic development, brownfield redevelopment. Early on, we realized it would need to be redeveloped in a mixed use manner, including affordable housing, including a 5-acre park. In 2019, our funding to acquire the site required city council approval. So City Council Ordinance 1939 set some of the broad parameters of the requirements for our acquisition of the site and redevelopment of the site. And it set out some very broad goals that get to exactly your questions. Why not more? Why not here? Why not there? But it required broadly 1,000 jobs be created on site, 1,000 housing units be created on site, 20 acres of parkland and open space, only 5 acres of which the city wanted to own and maintain as a public active city park. 15 acres, the Port Authority agreed to own and maintain in perpetuity as publicly accessible open space, wetlands, stormwater amenities, trails, et cetera, which we're happy to do. But we're an economic development agency. So our goal for the site was to hit 1,000 jobs, which we've spent through a master planning process nearly 3 years now, playing a game of Tetris. We were asked by all of our public sector colleagues to jam 150 or 160 acres of public goals into a 112-acre site. So as you can imagine, it's been a lot of feet and inches everywhere. The neighborhood, to that economic development mission, the neighborhood has 30,000 residents and 3,000 jobs. The largest private sector employer in the neighborhood is Cub Foods. So we feel like our mission is very imperative to this historically disinvested neighborhood. And the neighborhood feels like this is the right mix of jobs and housing. You put all that together, you get all the civils and enviros and geotechs and everybody it takes involved. We get to an approved master plan. Now we're at 30 going on 60% plan approval for the site infrastructure and utilities with the city. So now we're into turn lanes and setbacks and wetlands and all of the things that start eating away at what is core to our mission to deliver, which is this 1,000 jobs and 1,000 housing units. We're a fairly adept, probably we'd say the most in the city, state, at least, at land development. So how do we position these properties the best for their most productive end use? So every one of these parcels through the master planning process, we programmed with hypothetical buildings based off of real world information about what we know building end users will require. So for the industrial parcels, what kind of loading, how deep are their loading docks? Does 110 feet work? No, 120 feet to 150 feet. So it was that kind of Tetris all across this entire site. So we have obviously part of our mission is to advance sustainable development. I have spent my career on the east side working on advanced stormwater management, next generation stormwater management, we call it. And so we have done our best to advance sustainable development through every portion of the public sector goals as we've tried to play this game of Tetris. And I can tell you every turn lane, every setback, every easement for public art, there is a whole panoply, is that the right word? Of public goods that the Port Authority, as frankly a brother sister public organization responsible to the citizens of St. Paul and Ramsey County, we're responsible for delivering. And so we've tried to strike the right balance. We are keenly aware of the ecosystem services that these natural features provide and want to do our best to restore them. This is not a conservation project. This is a restoration project. All of these natural resources have been impacted by decades of use of a mercury containing product that was apparently used on steroids here compared to most other golf courses. It was sprayed ubiquitously across all fairways, greens, tee boxes, et cetera. So we've got to go get that stuff out. We've got to get it out of the wetlands. We want to do the right thing. We are frankly running up against some practicalities of what is feasible, what's feasible for development, what's feasible for all of these infrastructure services and ecosystem services. We do have real users in the marketplace that will announce our first transaction here at our board meeting in about 2 weeks for a bunch of the industrial acreage. And so we've got real world constraints here and are absolutely trying to do the best we can. We think we've come to a fairly reasonable approach to that. Obviously, you folks have a little different mission than the Port Authority and a little different purview. But we, along with our engineers at WSB, have tried to accommodate every one of these 160 acre goals within a 112 acre site. So I know it sounds like a ton of land, but by the time you layer in everyone's public interest, it gets to be a little cramped. I will say we are not and do not do this stuff with some, developer profit mentality. When we're squeaking out feet and inches here and there, it's not to accrue to the benefit of some private entity. It's to help us maximize all of these public goals and deliver the public goods we believe that the public entity we're required to deliver. So I'll leave it at that. I do know there will likely be a variance request coming through in the future related to some buffer zones that are getting a little pinched. Everything's getting a little pinched. I will tell you that the wetlands and the stormwater system, we believe will serve as an amenity to the community, an opportunity for interpretive programming, an opportunity for education, an opportunity to really serve an amenity of the residents and the businesses in the east side of St. Paul. So I'd love to talk to you guys about that when we get there. I don't know that we're necessarily there tonight. But broad picture, getting everyone up, kind of level set, that's kind of the state of the game. Is that fair?
That really helps.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Yeah.
Very beneficial. Thank you.
And I don't know this area very well. Do we know the type of wetlands and the proposed changes to what it would look like afterwards? Is that going to come as part of the permit?
Yeah, you would see that next, next month, or next time.
I think that's the only question that I had written down. Forgive me.
And I'll do and I'll do an unsolicited commercial for the Port Authority. Regular winner of Brownfields Awards for the state.
And the EPA?
Yeah, and the EPA, an extraordinarily, you use the word sustainable, Monty, the Port Authority is probably the most sustainable developer in the state. So congratulations.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
I have, I don't know how much time I want to take on this, but I have two questions or two points. One's more of a point, one's more of a question. And I don't know if you're able to answer at this point, Monty, or.
I get the hired guns here.
Yeah, there you go. I live in the area, and I'm curious, the soil remediation, there's gonna be many yards of material needing to be trucked.
Yep.
Do we know where that's going?
I think we do.
Well, we have a hunch, but that's.
We have to bid the contract and that's up to the contractor.
Can you say north, south, east, west?
South.
Yeah.
South.
It's landfill material, or is it, I'm assuming?
Well, it's sanitary landfill, so it's like where we take our garbage, so it's a hazardous material.
Hopefully daily cover.
So the amount's about 50,000 yards. There'll be a incredibly robust dust monitoring program out there during that operation, and then it will continue with the normal grading. So taking every precaution, but once we know for sure, we'll announce that on the project website so everyone knows where it's going.
We do have two state regulatory agencies overseeing the remediation activity. The Pollution Control Agency is obviously taking care of their jurisdictional compounds and chemicals. The Minnesota Department of Agriculture actually controls the regulation of the agricultural product, which is the main contaminant, the mercury. So that's presented a whole list of challenges related to environmental liability, because it's not sort of the cookie cutter brownfield to business center thing we've done for 30 years. Department of Ag has some statutory protections for farmers that look a little different in an urban redevelopment setting. So no lack of challenges on the remediation side, generally in the upper couple of feet of the soil, but literally across all 112 acres, depending on what tee box you're standing on. So we're going to have to turn a lot of dirt, but at the end of the day, I should say we are awaiting our U.S. Green Building Council pre-certification at the platinum level under what's called Lead for Communities, which as a land developer is a sustainability certification platform for large community redevelopments like this. and across all aspects of what we will touch, from infrastructure to green space to wetlands to human health and the environment. We have done our best with some of the best platforms in the world to certify that we're doing this in a sustainable fashion.
My last question written, you said you had a couple. Did you want to-
I guess my other point is just looking at the aerial that's included in the packet. I'm sure you'd be familiar with it as well, but it appears many of the wetlands, the majority of them are on the east side of the property. It has a fair amount of topography, and so drainage and routing is going to probably be a challenge in some respects. And I actually have done some work in wetlands on to the east there, and they have some issues in terms of stress. And so, you know, that might be, I won't say a concern, but certainly a consideration.
We do believe net we will positively impact the ecosystem services of this site and the adjoining areas. If we weren't accomplishing that, these guys would be in trouble.
And you hit on the question I had, which we'll see as part of the permit, looking at the impact of quality and flood management and water routing through, which was the very similar question I had. And I assume that's who ends up doing that assessment? Is that BAR or is that?
They would submit as part of their
The bars.
application, and then Nicole and.
Oh,
Brett.
forgive me, yeah, with Nicole.
Yep, Nicole, we would review that as part of the permit application.
Yeah, we actually sent preliminary stormwater comments today.
Okay.
So we're looking at, looking for all the modeling and looking at bounce and looking to see that the water being discharged is pre-treated with stormwater BMPs. So very broadly, obviously rate control and all that kind of stuff too. So, and I was just digging into the wetland replacement plan about your question about wetland types. The proposed impacts are to a variety of types, most of which are shallow open water or deep open water. And the proposed mitigation is a mix of deep open water or deep marsh and wetland, or excuse me, wet meadow fringe. So.
With the scale of the change, even with the rigor, it's going to be nice to see this comprehensive as things pieced together for the discussion. So definitely, if you guys are coming, it sounds like you're coming back is what it is. We welcome you to the conversation, but that's where my mind goes. I don't know where all the drainage paths are through this. I assume that's what the staff are going to do and you guys are going to work together on, but those are my questions. Very similar to what Mark was asking.
Yeah, I think the purpose of this memo tonight was, this is a complete WACA application that's been out for notice. So I wanted to let you know that this is generally speaking, you know, the mitigation that they're proposing, a mixture of on-site and off-site credits. So that's kind of what I wanted to focus on. It's going to get a lot more detailed with the grading permit applications and stormwater and buffers and all that kind of thing. But right now, just kind of starting with the general, you know, like this is what's being proposed as far as wetland impacts and replacement.
Can you help me understand the process flow here, Nicole? So it's out for notice right now, open for public comment, right? And then we're still going to submit through as a permit through our solution, or through our process.
Yeah.
After the notice.
No, they've
closes.
already done. They've already submitted their
Okay.
first
Oh, and
stormwater
it's under
review.
work. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but this WACA process is a state law. It's a different process. And so we want to make sure that this is already wrapped up before we're getting into the nitty gritty on everything else. So this is kind of a first step that the city of St. Paul is administering this process. So.
I like that they're replacing the on-site wetlands, and it's a bonus that we're getting payment through the banks. I don't have any other further questions.
So credit to your staff, that one-to-one on-site we were alerted to early on was going to be very important. And so we had to make sure we made that happen and then had to Tetris the rest.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
I will say timing wise, we are hopefully awarding a contract yet in March. Contractor wouldn't mobilize till June, but it's coming quick. Every month of dirt work we lose in the summer, we add to October and November, and it's probably the largest grading contract the Port Authority has administered and issued in 30 years. So I'll kind of work to get ready for this, and we appreciate your guys' regulatory perspective and role here, and anything we can do to make that path easier or clarify things, we're happy to do so. We've got a team of folks, some of the best in the biz, ready to answer whatever you guys got. But we do have real deals live in the marketplace you'll hear about in the next couple of weeks. That mean we got to get started. We got to get going.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Pleasure to meet you. Okay, so we're moving to stewardship grant programs. I guess this transition to you, Paige.
Yeah, so this one you're seeing is an additional fund request for a school in St. Paul. So the board approved back in, well, I guess probably about a year ago, to fund the school's construction of a filtration basin and a large native planting to help with some drainage problems that they've been experiencing on the site. They're looking to incorporate an outdoor classroom and get the students more involved out in this area, as well as helping with water quality and drainage issues. And you can see in the report that this was delayed just for various reasons, things they were waiting on. And then now with some changes that we requested to the planting plan and some other inflation costs, they've seen an increase in the stormwater management portion. So are requesting an additional $30,000 towards that project. And I do want to say, I'm definitely open for discussion, but I want to add that they submitted some revised plans yesterday, along with some their minimal impact design standard calculations. So we reviewed that, and there's a few questions that we have. There's just some discrepancies between the design and what the MIDS calculator shows. So if the board recommends approval of this, I would just like to add that the applicant will continue to work with staff to ensure that the revised plans meet the goal of the grant program. I have no concerns about that. The school and their designer know what we're looking for, so I have no concerns about them working with us to meet those requirements.
So I know I have some questions on this one. Does anyone else?
I have a couple of questions.
Let me lead on this one quick, and then I'll pass it to you if you don't mind. So I was looking at the increase amounts, and I know it's going above what we've set forth as a maximum limit. Could you help me understand a little better how much of it's due to the $30,000 increase due to our ask for changes to this program versus other things due to delays and construction cost increases?
Yeah, I'd have to look back for sure, but I think about 15,000 was for the plants, and the rest of it was for some of those costs for the soil work and just overall construction of those areas.
When I look at and I understand that this is for a school and the location of the school, where I struggle is it's asking for effectively a 30% increase over a maximum limit, and it's trying to be good stewards with the money and just trying to get a sense on what the return on investment for that extra 30,000 is really going to buy for that area. I know it's good for the kids, and so I want to acknowledge that, but trying to be good stewards of the money, I just have some questions with respect to what we're getting in return for going over the limit.
Yes, is that your question?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, no.
After you, I just rambled for a little bit, but
No, that was perfect. Yeah, so we will make sure, we'll look at the cost benefit. We look at that for every project. So that's what I'll work with. Brandon took a look at that today, and then Marcy at Bar. So making sure that we still have a good cost benefits dollar amount for the total phosphorus removed and the volume reduction that we're getting. We have, I would say this is not, well, I don't know how to say this. So we have funded school projects through our targeted retrofit program above this amount. We didn't run this through that program because originally they were under a pretty tight timeline to get it done last year. So they were able to find some additional funding, and they've gone that approach. But a lot of other, DNR and Bowser are giving grant funds as well. So there's a lot of eyes reviewing this and ensuring that it is a beneficial project.
I can't recall what the original amount was, Paige, in total for the total project cost.
Well, so the total was about 260,000. They've made, that included some of their outdoor classroom areas. So they made some changes on that side of it. So now the total is, I think, just a little bit over 230,000.
I'll pause on some additional questions. You want to ask some questions?
Yeah, I guess I have some similar line of questions. I was curious is this a precedent setting? Is this the first time that somebody has, a school or otherwise, exceeded that 100,000 for the stewardship grant?
Sure, the board has approved, I would say this is a significant request. The board has approved additional funds for other projects for similar reasons. I guess percentage wise, I don't know how that would relate. I can look back at that, but I think the reason I felt this was a suitable request was, a big chunk of that was due to our request in, the planting plan, and then just having that stewardship and partnership with the school. But we do allow people to request above our, our maximums, I guess we'll say loosely, if we deem them eligible. So we have had residential projects go above that, and other commercial or school projects go above that threshold.
And I guess my next question is, I probably should know this, but I'm curious how long those maximums have been in play for the stewardship grant. I mean, we've all heard about the economy, and have we had a number that are kind of pushing up? Is it something that we ought to revisit those? And that isn't something we have to fully discuss tonight, but it does kind of raise that question in my head.
Yeah, that's a good question. We look at this every year. I think we've had the same maximums for a few years now. We did really look at that this year. But we haven't been, I think our amounts are very generous. So we don't get these additional fund requests very often, and I don't promote it by any means. So it's not out there for everyone to just apply for, but if we see a project that's bumping up against that, that's when we would look at that. But so as of last year, the numbers were good, but we'll see where they come this year, especially for residential projects, if we need to increase that. But that's something we look at starting in about October.
I guess I had a follow-up from this conversation, just sparked my mind. Has staff looked at planting plans closely and worked with the school, I guess, at identifying any cost savings going maybe from plugs to more seating, containers to plugs, just to, work on lessening that budget request increase?
Yeah, so we review that with Ramsey's, I always want to say Ramsey Conservation District, but Ramsey Soil and Water. So they will look at that planting plan and make adjustments. And then part of the planting is also being funded through a Bowser help grant or DNR help grant. So they review those as well and look for some of those changes. So once the planting plan is also in in the works, so we will definitely review those and make sure that we're getting the savings we can. We also want to keep maintenance in mind. That's why we're hesitant with the seating. So we want it to be something that's, sustainable and established nicely going forward so that they can keep up with that maintenance. So we factor all that in the review.
Could you help me understand what would happen if we didn't give the extra 30K?
Honestly, I don't know that they would be able to go forward with it. They're strapped, it's a school, right? So they're strapped with their budget. They're at the maximum amounts for the other grants that they can receive. That being said, we will, we're gonna look at this latest revision and see what costs can be changed, but I think that's where they're up against now.
Just a reminder too, that our grants are reimbursement. So this is a not to exceed amount that we would give. So it doesn't mean that it would all be spent either. I don't know. They could spend up to that amount, but it's possible if there were cost savings that they would not reach the maximum.
Is there also like a 12-month look ahead at other stewardship opportunities that staff are discussing? Maybe that would help staff here realize, or maybe we do have this in the budget.
Yeah, I mean, you have the budget status report.
I guess I didn't dive into that.
Yeah, and Paige, I don't know if you can speak to like what's on the horizon for stewardship grant.
Yeah, yep. So we definitely have, looking at that budget status report, we do have enough funding. There's a couple, I would say, big project requests in the early planning stages. Hard to say if they'll happen this year or next year. But at this point, I don't feel that, taking this, if the board decides to approve these additional funds, that would prevent other projects from going forward. And typically what we've done in the past is if we bump up against that maximum, what we're allocating for the year, I can cut off large scale projects and make sure we save some of those funds for residential projects. And then also a lot, usually that would happen. Well, usually it's happened a few times where we bump up against our maximum for the year. And then a lot of big projects, if they're coming in September, October, they're not going to do construction until the following year. So we would ask them to just hold off until the following year to apply.
I have two very quick, I probably should have made note when I read this. But first, how large is the site that's being restored? And the second is, I was just looking at the table in terms of maximums. And I do remember reading that this is in an area that is, I'll say underserved or kind of a DJ. Would it qualify as a priority area in the district?
It is, yes.
Yeah, just wanted to clarify. So how large is the site?
So the site itself, I don't know how big the actual school site is. The project area is under an acre. So we're still looking at, the drainage area. One set of calculations, it's taking about 13 acres of drainage, but the actual project area itself is probably about a little over a half acre.
Thank you.
And I was wanting to return to the point that Mark brought up about setting precedents. And when I think about going over this amount, I understand the priority area. It feels to me that if we're not really transparent on why they qualify for going over our own set amounts in terms of what process we followed to feel comfortable here, it could lead to being viewed as unfair. Now, once again, it's a school, it's a priority area. But they are going over what we typically have, or at least publicly shown as our maximum. So it feels to me we need at least a set of criteria to feel confident that going this 30 is good here, but won't be good in this other place that doesn't qualify. So I'm not sure if that's asking for a motion or what, but when I think about this, we need a process to figure out what to do to go over and why it's okay in this case. Because it is quite large going over from the ones that I've approved going over maximums in the past.
So I know it's not this doesn't really help, but it does in our documents for the Kusher program, it does say at the discretion of the board, you can, you know, ask for additional funds and they may be given, so that you have discretion to do that. I understand the desire though to want to have some qualifiers. I think it has been typical that if staff were to ask, like in this case, we think you'll have a more successful project if you use plugs. I think that's reasonable. The inflation costs or the, you know, increase in costs due to the delays. I don't know if we've done that in the past.
Well, even assuming a 10% inflation on everything, that's only 10K plus the 15K that we had or proposed, and it sounds like there's a 5K buffer, if you will.
Yeah.
I just in my math, it feels like we are owed them the change that we're requesting. I feel comfortable with that, but the rest of it, because of the size, that's what's giving me pause.
The biggest justification that Paige already mentioned, but I just, the switch from seeding to containerized, that's a big cost, and 15,000 and all of that, that was really at the ask of the district for the likelihood of success. And so in some respects, if you take that into consideration, that 30,000 becomes somewhat potentially reduced.
Well, and that's where, if we had a good breakdown of what that 30K is, let's say what I'm gathering, it's at least 50% what we're asking per this conversation. But if it's because of our increased ask that we have now additional cause additional work leading to additional inflation and cost of development, that would be helpful, make me feel better. More comfortable with this.
Paige, are you confident in the 15,000 breakdown between the additional plant costs versus the increased costs due to soil work? And
Yes, I mean, it's roughly that, yes. But are you, Val, asking for that to come back next month or?
No, well, it sounds like if we do a motion, you've asked for it to be slightly altered, the motion, right? That you want to revise some of the changes that came back, right? So it's going to be moved and condition of that is, did I say that correctly?
Yeah, be conditional approval based on staff review. If you're
Right.
comfortable,
Yeah, but I was gonna ask if we could do a conditional kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that we take action, but it kind of asks for us to cover tracks in a sense.
Yep, yeah. If you're comfortable with that, though, that would be staff approval then at the back end. So when we're comfortable with the design.
Would it go in the consent agenda, Tina?
It wouldn't under that circumstance. If you were to table it and ask for, more information, then it would come back next time for your review.
What is the impact? So this program's already faced delays. I do recall as it came through that they're wanting to go quickly, right?
Yeah.
What's the chances of us delaying it another month for you guys to look at it again? What is the impact to the project?
I don't, so they would start the work after school is out. But I think I don't know, and I don't want to pressure you, definitely can table it, but I think it would be if the board is not going to approve it, then that sets them back, then they would just be out that month, I guess, and they would have to make the decision if the project can happen or not.
I mean, they do have a window, right, of construction during the summer. And they would need to let the project, I'm assuming, for bid.
Yeah, and they wouldn't do that until they have our approval.
So Tina, remind me, it's at our discretion that we can pick. If we choose to go forward with this one and choose not to go forward with another overage, what are we looking at there in terms of justification, liability?
Maybe Lauren wants to speak. I don't know if you have.
Yes, yeah, I was gonna chime in. To your point, Val, what needs to be done if you're gonna kind of vary from what kind of the standard tables show is exactly what you're doing. You need to have a discussion and the minutes need to reflect that discussion and why you came to the decision you came to. So I think the discussion that you've had tonight is just exactly as it should be, and the minutes should reflect if you do decide to depart from what the tables say and award something in addition, then you should just show your basis for that decision. And know then if the minutes say that and a scenario comes up that looks very similar, it'd probably be good to follow a similar line of decision making. But I'm not worried about liability or anything like that, because the applicants should know that you have discretion over all of this, over whether to award the grant in the first place and to go above and beyond.
So maybe just for the discussion, I'm going to say these are areas of pros and cons, if you don't mind, if we just have that really quickly. So it's a high priority area. It's in an equity area. It's at a school, so there's benefit to children. Learning environments is what I've gathered. And 4, it's largely due to the request of Ramsey-Washington Metro Watershed District. Those are the pros. The cons are we will need to end up talking through these overages in the future, which we will anyway. We're worried about setting precedents, which once again will resolve through discussion, and it's significantly over our maximum limit. So how do others feel?
I believe that that's a good summary of the discussion. I guess I have one maybe added that might be a con, and it's a question to Paige or Tina perhaps, but within the program, how frequently have we at all experienced other overages? I'm wondering the scenario of, because these are all estimates, we approve an additional $30,000, they go forward and do the project and they find out, oh, wow, it really is like 145, we underestimated this, and not to set ourselves up that we have to, struggle with that kind of a decision in the future, because as Tina mentioned, these are all reimbursement basis, and I mean, there's potential we could refuse, and but given that it's a school, they have a lot less kind of, they have more budget constraints, a lot less that they can potentially draw from if it does go higher. So that's a little bit of a con, because it sounds like there's a fair amount of complexity, with the soil work and several other grant supporters, and
I will add to your pro list, I think I would put this in as, and Paige mentioned this earlier, I just want to bring it back up, is that normally a project like this would go through our targeted retrofit project program, where we wouldn't have $100,000 cap, right? Or even a $200,000 cap. We would do what was best for the project and for the benefits that we would be receiving. So the fact that it did run through the stewardship grant is puts that cap on it that wouldn't normally happen there, I should say.
All right, what prevents us from reclassifying it into the target retrofit at this point?
So for target retrofits, we would bid the project, construct the project, do the work, yeah.
I just wanted it to be clear. How do people feel on their likelihood of moving this forward? I'll say my opinion.
I'm very comfortable moving forward.
I'm probably comfortable. I am curious if you could off top page give a response to how frequently do we see overages on estimates, be it residential, commercial, or whatever. I mean, is it pretty regular?
Yeah, I would say not regular. There are cases where something comes up during construction and they go over, but I would say for the most part, we see the contractors, sticking to that bid. And I know the school already has a contractor in play, and he's been part of the design process and working with their consultants on that. So I feel confident in that. And we, this can be, this is our not to exceed number, right? Like we can definitely say that. We've had projects in the past come through because there is an increase, something happens in the field and there is an increase. So we've had that come back to the board. So yeah, not to say it doesn't happen, but I would say it's fairly infrequent.
What do you think, Ben?
I'm comfortable for the reasons of equity being a priority area. Maybe it got classified wrong and I'm trying to hastily move the project forward. I would also say we may not just apply the 10% to our funding because it sounds like a lot of other grants are up against their caps. So we may be, applying a little more leverage on the project. So just looking at 10% because obviously the 100,000 isn't the full project cost. So I guess for those reasons, I would be comfortable on this one moving forward.
I have one last question. Sorry. This is phase 2 of a 3-phase. If you can comment on that, because you had said earlier that it's likely the entire project to be something like 230, possibly 260,000. And I'm wondering if
It's the total.
Yeah, so it will
project.
all be done this year. I don't know if I said it was 3.
so that's a previous award that
No,
It's just that the project is a lot more than the 100,000 they asked for, or 130.
Oh,
yes.
from
So there's
other,
funding, other things.
and
Yeah.
Bowser, okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yes.
I remember discussing about this last March.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, my opinion is I'm comfortable moving forward with it for the reasons we discussed as pros. But I would also, I don't know how to change the motion because we need to move to approve this, but could you help us with that on what we say in the motion?
Yeah, I guess I was, you both had said you're probably comfortable. I have a little bit of pause, but I think with a conditional, so if I can offer a conditional
that's right.
motion and help me if I don't get it quite right.
Yep.
I move that we conditionally approve this additional request. And that condition being staff document through minutes and maybe further investigation, some of the points that were raised as part of our discussion. Is that close to it?
Right, so the condition would be that, as Paige mentioned, that there might be some revisions to the plan yet, and that there would be staff approval based that it would meet the goals of the program.
Yeah, so it wouldn't come back to us. We're essentially taking action.
Yeah.
And so further final action may be done by staff.
And then we'll make sure the minutes reflect the discussion for sure.
Okay, so
The motion is to approve.
move to approve
Yeah.
the grant conditionally for staff approval. As stated by Mark. Do we have a motion for that?
Motion by Mark.
Yes.
Yes.
So
Do I need to restate it?
No,
Or is
no,
that
you
good?
say so.
Okay.
We're good.
I wouldn't get it right. So.
We'll work on that in the minutes.
Yeah, I'll offer a second.
Okay, further discussion. I do have one extra ask on this. If a change does come across, please at least highlight
Sure.
this for us in the future. Second piece is, if you don't mind, as part of either the program summary or maybe a discussion point next time, just walk us through what the changes were and how you feel comfortable with it. Those two things would be very helpful for the next time around, but trust your judgment.
Sounds good.
Yeah,
I'll
absolutely.
add to that motion that was up to $130,000 total.
Thank you.
Okay.
Any other discussion? Roll call.
I'm-
Paige, are you good? Does that all
Yes.
sound good?
And Tina, I was gonna say, I thought maybe a year or two ago, maybe it was longer, we looked at, I don't know if it was a formal policy, but adding in, having the board look at when we could approve additional funds. So I'll look for that and include that next time too.
I recall that being discussed when I was on the board. So yeah, that would be.
Okay, so it was with you, yes. Yeah, I'll look for that and we can bring it back.
Discussion, roll call, please.
Ben.
Aye.
Mark.
Aye.
Yeah.
Aye.
Val.
Hey. Now the exciting action items.
All right, Paige, you wanna head off that first one for Lake Owasso?
Yes. No questions on the budget status, was that?
Forgive me, Paige, I jumped over the budget status.
That's all right.
I apologize. I did not have any questions. I made an assumption that others didn't. Good. Yes, let's jump to action items.
Okay. So Lake Owasso shoreline restoration, this is phase 2 of our Lake Owasso restorations. You may recall, or for the new board members, we've done pretty large scale restoration projects on Snail Lake in Shoreview and Twin Lake in Little Canada. We did the, what would that be, northeast side of Lake Owasso last year. We had 10 residents move forward with that. And this year we had 6 residential properties. Little, I don't want to say disappointed, but I thought we would get a bigger turnout in this stretch, but the project areas are actually pretty big. There's some people with some pretty long shorelines that are very interested in moving forward with this. So I'm excited to have them on board. They're all excited. Most of them were keeping a close eye on what happened last year on Owasso. So they're familiar with the process and with the work that we've done at the beach boat launch area with the natural resources crew. So they're pretty excited about that. So we are set to have that go out to bid Friday, pending your approval tonight, and then we'll select a contractor and bring that back to you in May.
I only had the same question I asked for the last one's page was, so you mentioned it about, it's only 6 residents. Did you get a sense why other people didn't want to do this, or?
No, I think
Because
we sent out, this was actually the largest effort we made with, I don't know if that on map. So we, sent it to basically everyone on Heino Drive. I can't remember exactly how many residents, but we, sent mailers. We did a next door post. Lake Owasso has a pretty active lake association, so we shared information with them, but I just, for whatever reason, they aren't interested. A lot of times with these projects, people will see them go in and then they'll, neighbors may call after and be interested in going forward with something, which they absolutely can through our typical cost share program. We just wouldn't, with this, we're obviously hiring the contractor, but if they go forward with it on their own, they would have to do that piece, but we could still design and, grant fund that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we had on public record that they could still come forward, and that you said it perfect.
That's good.
Any other questions on Lake Owasso? Request for bid. Do we have a motion to move forward with this?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, further discussion? And then roll call, please, Tina.
Okay, Ben,
Aye.
Mark,
Aye.
Matt,
Aye.
and Val.
Okay, next up is the Abergast underground storm filter advertised for bid.
Paige, did you want to high level that one too, or Brandon?
Yeah. Oh yeah, Brandon's there too. So I'll start Brandon, but jump in if I forget anything. So this is for the construction of an underground stormwater filtration project near Lake Emily in Shoreview. So I can't remember when the board first saw this, but through the feasibility study, we had identified 2 potential projects, and one was determined that it wasn't very feasible to move forward with. So we opted for this project here, and it would go through our targeted retrofit program to be constructed this summer. And then, as is mentioned in the board action request, that we have received Bowser Clean Water Fund grants dollars that we will be allocating for this project as well. So that's all in there. So the goal would be to have these go out for bid after your approval tonight and bring the contractor selection back in May.
Awesome. Any questions for Paige? Ben, I was curious if you had a question.
Yeah, I did have a question. I was reading about the differences between the iron enhanced sand and the CC17. Noticed that you decided to go with the CC17 due to oxygenation and anoxic levels of IES in this instance. So are these ever designed, or would it be feasible with something like this to provide iron enhanced as a secondary or tertiary treatment method?
Yeah, so good question. The 30% design did include iron enhanced sand. And at that point, as part of that design, that was selected because it had a higher treatment efficiency than CC17. Moving to the 95% design here, the filter media was switched because of those longer prolonged flows. The CC17, as you noted, can stay inundated for longer periods of time, and it doesn't affect the treatment efficiency that's provided. So an iron enhanced sand system would be better suited for conditions like you described, either secondary treatment or high flow treatment, where you only capture the peak, but you miss that prolonged period of base flow. So in scenarios like that, yes, it could be used. For this particular application, this DMP is capturing the majority of the flows at this location. So adding in a secondary or tertiary treatment wouldn't be a cost-effective application at this particular location.
Thank you. That's a good question. I have a couple of questions. I'm not that familiar with these media bed treatments, but it may have been stated and I missed it. How long can we anticipate the CC17 to be effective?
It's a good question. The lifespan of the CC17, or really any of these enhanced filter medias, is going to be dependent on the phosphorus concentrations that are coming in. The higher the concentrations, the shorter that lifespan. I believe that the CC17, though, it's on the order of years that you're talking about life cycle. This is not something that is going to be a seasonally based, and you have to replace it.
Is flow at all? I mean, part of the transport of phosphorus is going to be flow related, so flow is going to be a factor. But other than that kind of loading aspect, is if you have a drier season, does that kind of advance the age? So it's not just flow.
Yeah, I mean, from the chemical reaction, there's a maximum capacity there, right? And so that is driven by loading in particular. And so the one of the benefits with the CC17 is that whether or not it's a wetter season where there's longer periods of prolonged inundation, or a drier season, the chemical reaction, the removal of phosphorus will continue. But so the loading is the main mechanism, I think, that drives the lifespan.
And then I guess related to that, and maybe to contrast with a iron media, maintenance costs.
Yeah, so in terms of application here, CC17 is used in, this is the media that's in the Coleman weir. So it's a slightly different application. The benefits with the CC17 is that it's a more aggregate type of consistency. So you have less maintenance costs with the fluffing, turning of the media. But with any of these underground filters, there's the inspections to make sure that your water is still flowing through it. You're not getting debris and partial plugging. So there's certainly maintenance associated with it, but relative to the iron enhanced sand, I think there's less maintenance with this particular type media.
I guess I was thinking bigger context where you've got to open it up and remove the media because it's pretty much saturated and we got to start over. And that is a potential down the road, hopefully not far down the road, but
absolutely. And with these and that's certainly a design consideration with underground filters in general. And with this particular underground filter, there's discussion of stop logs in there to be able to adjust the flow that is is being conveyed through the system. And so the underground filter is designed such that you have a container, and when it's constructed, the initial media within this container is the CC17, but when you down the road, it's set up such that that media could be replaced at a future date with something different if that comes along. So you wouldn't have to replace the whole thing. You're just doing the maintenance on the media itself.
And that maintenance and replacement potential is factored into the cost benefit calculation, I'm assuming. Typically maintenance would be, I don't know about replacement.
Typically that it's factored into like that life cycle cost
Right.
for the BMP when calculating pounds removed per year.
Per year.
And this would be one that we inspect, right?
Yeah.
Just to double check.
Yeah, this would be one we would inspect and maintain,
Uh,
correct? Or is the city,
Well,
taking
I think the
responsibility.
MOU was that it would be Ramsey-Washington would do the maintenance over the first 2 years. And then maintenance would be passed over to the city for, I think it was a 25-year period.
Correct.
Any further questions? Could I have a motion to approve the preliminary designs, estimated costs, and proposed project schedule, and direct staff to finalize design and bidding documents to solicit bid proposals?
I would motion approval.
Second.
Further discussion? So roll call, please, Tina.
Ben,
Aye.
Mark,
Aye.
Lance,
Aye.
and Val.
Christian. All right, last on the action list, the 2023-2025 BMP maintenance program selection of contractors.
Page again.
Yes, I think this is my last one. So this is our annual, we have an annual BMP maintenance program. So in the past, we have done a 2-year contract. This year. Well, we actually thought about it last year to go to a 3-year. So this would cover 2023 through 2025. Just makes it a little bit easier for contractors to plan and for us to kind of plan who's going to be doing what sites. So we have opted to go with the 3 contractors that you see below. We've worked a lot with Sandstrom Land Management and Davie Resource Group in the past. Rockleaf Water Environmental is a little bit newer. I think the company itself has been around for a while, but they're getting more involved in maintenance. And we saw last year they worked on a number of stewardship grant projects. So I was able to work with them on those, and they put together a great bid package. And after some conversations and with their staff and with their references, we felt very comfortable selecting them as part of our pool for this term.
Paige, can you remind us who was doing them the last couple of years, if you don't mind?
Yeah, so the last few years we've had Sandstrom Land Management, Davie Resource Group, was formerly Outdoor Lab, and then Minnesota Native, or MNL. They had been on the list for quite some time. MNL, they always did great work. They were just a little bit higher price than these 3, as were the other 2 contractors that submitted.
Yeah, it's our job to pick the lowest, most responsible, right, highest reputable. I'm trying to remember the conditions used.
Yeah, this is a little different because it's a request for qualifications. It's not like a construction bid. So it's prudent to choose the ones that have the most reasonable prices.
I was going to ask if the selection was based more on qualifications or past experience that we or others might have, or cost, or other factors. Because there were, I believe, 11 bids that were received. I don't remember the exact number, but
6, right?
Yeah, we had 6. Yep. So I would say all of those things, Mark, were factored in. There were 2 that were significant, just their prices were significantly higher. So they were ruled out right away. And then between the other 4, it was a little bit of a close call. We also factored in their office location. So these 3 are all located around the St. Paul, Roseville area. So a little easier for them to get to the project sites. Not that they ever have big emergencies, but if we need something quickly, we factored that in, and then experience as well. So I did talk to a number of references for rock leaf water, and they all, as part of the bid package, were asked to submit, similar projects, scopes, and maintenance projects that they've worked on. And so we were able to see those. And obviously we worked a lot with the other two, so felt comfortable just based on our knowledge of past experience with them, moving forward with them again.
Did we solicit input from the partners for which projects are to be done?
We don't. So all of these projects, some of these are our natural resource sites. So we added those, so those are, I guess, up to us to decide. The school sites, I don't know how many years ago now, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, started with our targeted retrofit program on school projects and decided that Ramsey-Washington would cover maintenance on those sites indefinitely, just because, obviously schools, they don't have a lot of staff around in the summer, don't have funds to maintain these. So that was part of our agreement with them. Sage works with them every spring and fall to have students do some maintenance, but then we provide that. So that's up to us. And then with some of our newer targeted retrofits like Mounds Park Academy, St. Pascal's, and where are we? North St. Paul Target, that is left up to us. We write that kind of into our agreement with them when we hire the contractor, that we will do that 2 years of maintenance with whoever is under our kind of current maintenance contract at the time.
Yeah, so these are all our projects that we're maintaining now. And then
we discussed them earlier, right? If I recall, I'm trying to remember.
Discuss
The
the
programs that are covered in BMP in the past.
for BMP maintenance. Yeah. So like she mentioned, there's the NR, we have some NR sites, natural resources sites that we're maintaining, and then mostly the rest of them are mostly through our targeted retrofit program.
Those are good questions. There's a lot of history and this recognized at least one of them.
Yeah, it's pretty great program. I will just point out that we do have the Snail Lake shoreline restorations as part of this bid. We're still under contract with the installation contractor on Twin Lake and Lake Owasso phase 1. So that's Landbridge Ecological. So they'll be doing maintenance on those sites, but Snail was up for renewal this year.
Any further questions? Good questions. Awesome. Can we do we have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Further discussion and roll call.
Ben?
Aye.
Mark?
Aye.
Matt?
Aye.
And Beth?
Aye. Lauren, attorney report, please.
Yes, hi.
Welcome back.
Thank you. Yes, I don't really have anything to report. This is my 3rd day back at work from maternity leave. So it's nice to meet the new managers. Hopefully I'll get to meet you in person one day. And Val, congrats on where you're sitting. And yeah, I'm here to answer any questions that you might have, but I don't have anything specific to report to you all tonight.
Tina, would this be an acceptable time to ask a question about roll call? Lauren, we've been chatting and learning more about our board rules, and we were curious. Today we go through and do a roll call for each of the managers. Is there anything against us moving toward a all approved say aye mechanism with our configuration being hybrid with some of the staff and the public, but the board being present in the room?
So if the board is all present in the room, a roll call isn't necessary. But if anyone is opposing, then a roll call would be needed to follow up on how each manager voted. But yeah, technically, if you're all present in the same room and voting, then you can start with all in favor, aye. And then if you hear any opposed, then take a roll call from there.
I think that sounds wonderful. Do you mind if we move that direction for future meetings? Does that seem acceptable?
From my standpoint, yes.
Sweet. I just wanted you to say yes. I need permission though.
I didn't know if you were asking for mine or Tina's or I can't tell where you're
Good
looking.
with it.
Yours.
Yes, I'm good with it too.
Okay, awesome.
And
Not
just
that I
to
don't love
clarify
hearing
then,
everything.
if someone is joining by Zoom, like if we do a hybrid, then a roll call is needed, which is why we always did roll call when we were on
Yeah.
Zoom during the pandemic. Mhm.
I think that makes a lot of sense if we have a board member there. From what I understood, we weren't allowing board members to vote if they were remote.
That's
And the-
correct, unless it's noticed, right?
Unless it's noticed.
Yep. So if it were noticed
Then we
that
could-
somebody was off-site and they were voting while on Zoom, then we would do a roll
In
call.
a public announced place.
Yes,
Yes.
public accessible, yep.
Thank you very much, Lauren.
Yes,
Congratulations.
thank you.
Next part is the number 9. Kind of wanted to keep it short and sweet. This is kind of just to high level why the board discussion topics are here. There, through conversations with Tina, we made a couple of agenda changes. You might have noticed the title changes. Really, the intention of this is just to highlight things that we want to bring forward or ask Tina to look into, or staff to look into. Forgive me, Tina, but you're the conduit there. And so we made some changes. We've renamed it from board issues, policies, and operations to board discussion topics, which include all of those things, just to keep it nice and sweet. This month, and just to highlight, we're looking for, hey, if you've gotten feedback from constituents that are worth a discussion, you're going to notice that there's topics, spring flood risk assessment. I've been asked by some of the residents within the watershed about what is our plans, what are we doing there. So there is you'll see it in the project status, plus I think we can ask some questions next. The second one is thoughts from last week. If something came up, please, this is for discussion here. It'd be wonderful if you could let Tina know prior to this. The agenda typically is done a week to a week and a half beforehand. That would be helpful, obviously myself or Tina there. And then lastly, ideas for future agendas or policies for discussion. So that's really what the intention is there. The spring flood risk assessment through conversations because of talking with other people and they're concerned, and some of the recent publications that were in various newspapers around how St. Croix is flooding and there's a large amount of snow. I had asked Tina if we could add this here plus the write-up in the project summary. I don't know if we need to talk about it now. It's hopefully y'all read the project summary and how they're associating or assessing it. But I assume if there's no questions, or do you have any questions on spring flood? It sounds like it's computationally driven. We've had still getting a lot of precipitation.
Yeah.
I'm assuming this is probably an ongoing thing for you, especially knowing how vocal some of our resident constituents are.
And rightly so. It's I mean, flooding is a big concern. It can be very disruptive. So we have staff and we have eyes in the watershed, and you just can't be everywhere. And so getting that feedback from residents, from people that live and work in the watershed is helpful to make sure that we're not missing something. Right? But you are right, it is a iterative because forecasts change, rainfall changes, and we update the models and rerun several times throughout the melt.
And the 12A report consists of a model that was run recently, if I read that correctly. Is that correct?
12A walked through kind of
Like the process?
The process. So there weren't any model results that were presented in 12A, but we wanted to give you an overview of the data sets that we're looking at, where we're pulling information from, things that we're considering as we're keeping an eye on when flooding might be occurring within the watershed and how we go about assessing it.
And if when you guys do run a flood risk assessment, would you mind putting that also in the project status report? That would be a nice way just to signal to us that you ran it. And, do we put that anywhere else?
No, I mean, we typically, that's for staff internal decision-making based on, like, I think it says in the report too, where we have control, right? So some of the outlet controls, that's the information we would use to determine if those are needed to be used. It's not typically something we would publish.
But we'll be equipped to address calls and concerns as the water.
Right, yeah.
That's really what I'll make sure that we're prepped for.
And then if we're seeing something, we're communicating with member cities, county, MnDOT, stakeholders within the watershed, so that they're also aware that maybe a flood risk is more imminent or likely. And so we'll share that information with them as it becomes available.
How frequent, I mean, flood prediction can be a very dynamic kind of thing. And especially as we move into a thawing ground and snowpack and spring rains that may or may not come, and they could come in very large or very small portions. Do you do model runs on what kind of frequency?
It kind of depends. It depends on how the forecast changes. It depends on the rainfall that actually falls. And it depends on if we're seeing responses in the lakes match the runs that we've already completed. And so a lot of times what we'll do is we take estimates for water equivalent in the snowpack, and they're estimates. And so we'll go through and we'll set starting levels, and then we'll run a whole suite of storms and say, okay, based on the current estimate, this is where we think we're going to be trending, plus or minus. And then when we get rainfall on top of that, we can go and we've got the runs completed. We can adjust where we're looking kind of within that uncertainty range.
To already kind of prepare for some additions on a previous model run, you can give a new interpretation potentially.
Correct. Yep. That's correct.
I'm wondering, Tina, I mean, being new to the board, and I guess as Val is saying that, I mean, you've had some citizens kind of inquire, and would there be value in putting on having some presence on the website, not all the nuts and bolts, but a landing place of floods within the Ramsey-Washington, and share more broadly with the public? Has that ever been discussed? Would there be value?
So, yeah, I think one way that we look at that is, so we have our lake level stations that are on our website. And so that is informing people of lake levels, and they can see the historical level, the rising, the falling of the lake levels. I think it's a lot to expect a casual user of our website to interpret. And so like Val said, as we receive calls or they're forwarded to us, or things come in, we can have a more one-on-one conversation. I would say anything that we would put on our website would be very general, kind of overviews of the situation. If we were in a place where there'd be emergency management, we'd have connections, to the emergency management or the city websites. So there are opportunities to definitely inform, but we have to kind of do that in a way that's helpful or useful for the general public.
And that's actually in discussion and setting up the agenda, why we wanted to bring it up here. This is a publicly disclosed conversation. And it was also very important for new board members, because I know I've learned a lot from what they do here, and it's all they're trying to do it preemptive. So what we were hoping in putting in the agenda and putting in the project schedule with the project status report with the process, it is accessible from an interested party on the site. At least that's what the intention was. I'm not sure how else to simplify it to the public, but I do know that if there are risks, we hear them very quickly. I think you have a good point, because it's a passion of mine to inform. This seemed like a good way of providing a pathway for people to understand what we do, which is why we wanted to talk about it.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, it's not a simple subject to disclose, there's, from a layperson who's never dealt with it, a 50-year flood versus a 100-year flood. Does it happen once every 50 years? No, similar to storm events. So even that kind of information on our landing page might help people.
Yeah, I like what the explanation provided in the program summary. There might be, if depending on the changes of what's happening weather-wise, there might be an advantage to calling or breaking that separate and saying, hey, this is what the staff does in participation with the cities and everything else to prepare and address. That's kind of what I think it's gonna, that's my opinion, which is exactly why we want to talk about it.
Yeah, we could definitely do like a newsletter article,
Yeah, that'd be
something
exactly
that
it.
talks about the
That was
process.
exactly where, something in the ripple,
Yeah,
because it
Yeah.
does, the readership is pretty broad.
A
But
good suggestion.
it seems from what I read in the materials that we're kind of in a moderate to low is where we are. If we were at a higher, if we were
Right.
sitting in kind of a, Red River Valley or St. Croix, a lot more people would be on edge and they'd be looking for information. And so maybe something in the newsletter could, and it might direct them to other, if they want to dig in.
I would love that suggestion, actually, that because that would reach people who are interested and give them an outlet for understanding. If the staff is willing to do that.
we will work on that. Lauren is on maternity leave.
Oh,
at
yes,
this
that's right.
time. So the person I would normally ask to write that, but doesn't mean that we can't work with our staff and our staff to come up with something to send out. I do want to give you some assurances too, that if there were some kind of red alert situation, you would hear about it from us, from staff. And there would be more, communication that we would work with, like you said, our cities and emergency managers on this.
I'm recognizing the time, and we had put on the adopt a culvert. I don't think there needs to be a motion to table that. Can we table that for
Yeah, we
next
can just
week?
bring it up next time.
Because I think the watershed discussion is going to take a bit. The last thing that I wanted to highlight are just a couple other agenda changes. We have the tracking action logs. This is an important piece for staff, and Tina's been kind enough to manage it, and she's also the accountable party there. So we move that to the administrative section. And then finally, at the end, I just want to draw attention to this. We're going to keep it on for this week's agenda because I think it's nice. Manager comments in next month's meeting. This is kind of, you've seen everything, you've read everything. Is there anything that we need to add? And it's kind of a call to action at the end of the meeting. Once again, if you have something for discussion, let Tina or I know prior to setting up the agenda next time. So that's what I just wanted. There are some agenda changes. The intention is still there. Awesome. So without further ado, do you mind jumping to this district wetland management strategies?
Yeah.
And may I make I'm gonna have to go. I just got a burglar alarm from my
Oh,
company.
no.
Oh, no.
Which it's been very windy and we have had a
Yeah.
problem with the front doors flecting, but I'm gonna go meet the Ramsey County Sheriff there.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Thank you.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good
And
luck.
that-
Yeah.
Should I put the presentation up on the screen?
Sure, yeah, I didn't.
Or are you gonna log in?
Here for me to.
Yeah, why don't we do that? Let's join the meeting. This is Greg Williams. For those that haven't met Greg before from Bar Engineering.
Yeah, actually, I don't think I've been to a meeting since any of you joined the board.
Voting.
Installing updates to Zoom.
I'll share my screen and we can work our way.
We'll be ready for next time, right?
In 2 years, you got it.
Here, sorry. Page.
179 if it matters.
Oh my gosh, I gotta be on the right keyboard. What no? It was 170.
179.
Thank you. All right.
Well, just to give you a little bit of background, this has been, I think, a couple of years in the making, is that correct?
that there was a request to provide a little bit more information about what the Ramsey-Washington Metro Watershed District does with respect to wetland management. How that's described in your plan, in your implementation program, in your policies and your rules, how that aligns with what other folks with your roles and responsibilities do in the Twin Cities metro area, and then whether there are appropriate modifications or revisions to better accomplish your goals and things that might make sense to change with respect to your wetland management programs. The purpose of this presentation here is kind of threefold. One is to just kind of develop a shared understanding about the roles and responsibilities with respect to wetland management of the Ramsey-Washington Metro Watershed District. Try to gauge your interest in whether you think that's appropriate level of involvement or whether you'd like to do more, and then get direction from you guys on whether or not that's something to evaluate further. Real quickly, the presentation will cover kind of a summary of past work, just background on wetlands, what your roles are right now, what are the roles of those other watershed districts, the potential revisions, and then that discussion piece. And then,
Great.
and then as I mentioned, the purpose of just reviewing those roles and determining if changes are warranted. A little bit of background here is that wetlands are defined kind of by three things: the presence of hydric soils, vegetation, and hydrology. And because of that, there are many different types of, some of them don't look like wetlands. You may not see standing water and that sort of thing. There's quite a bit of variety in wetlands throughout the district. Things like shallow marsh and deep marsh, and you can kind of look at and know that they're wetlands. Things like floodplain forests and wet meadows may not immediately look like wetlands, but they do meet those requirements. Sometimes it's a seasonally flooded basement. I hope not. Seasonally flooded basement. You do have a watershed-wide inventory that's included in your watershed management plan. The wetlands within the watershed have been classified according to what we refer to as MinRAM. It's the Minnesota Rapid Assessment Method. And what that does is looks at functions and values and ranks them to determine an overall quality of the wetland. And your district classifies them as manage A, manage B, and manage C in order of decreasing quality. Different organizations have their own terminology, but they typically follow like a 1, 2, or 3 or an ABC type of thing. Your watershed management plan kind of outlines what your goals are with respect to wetland management. And wetlands are roped into the goals or signs of success that are in the plan, most explicitly in the quantity of ecologically diverse aquatic, wetland, and associated, I think that's just habitats, is increased, and that wetlands are preserved and protected as measured by their net area. This is sometimes referred to as no net loss, and the continued viability of their functions and values. So again, that's getting into that functions and values piece. So it's basically, you preserve the quality and quantity. In terms of regulation, this came up earlier, you are the Wetland Conservation Act, the LGU, or the local jurisdictional unit for that throughout the district, with the exception of St. Paul and areas that are governed by the Minnesota Department of Transportation. But for the most part, you handle the WACA stuff, and you also have buffer requirements that are part of your rules. Monitoring, you guys have done district-wide inventory and classification, but I don't believe you are actively monitoring wetlands through an ongoing program. And with respect to projects and studies, there are elements of your plan that allow for projects related to wetland restoration or those natural area restoration, but there are not currently capital projects identified in the plan that are on your schedule, so to speak. This is just a matrix of how that lines up with what other organizations in the Twin City Metro do. So here we've got Ramsey-Washington Metro Watershed District is the first column. We also looked at Bassett Creek Watershed Management Commission over in the Golden Valley, Plymouth area, Capital Region, which is mostly St. Paul, the Lower Mississippi River WMO, Minnehaha Creek Watershed District, 9 Mile Creek, South-Washington Watershed District, your neighbor to the south here, and the Valley Branch Watershed District. And in terms of what the roles and responsibilities are of those other organizations and how they align with yours, pretty much everybody does some WACA administration, and many of these organizations have adopted rules. Almost everybody has wetland standards that they enforce. Some districts have hydraulic or hydrologic standards for wetlands that I'll get into in a minute. You as an organization do not. Pretty much everybody does some sort of inventory or study, some more intense than others. And a few actually pursue capital projects specific to wetland restoration or creation. And a lot of organizations manage waters that are classified as wetlands. And in this case, you as an organization do manage a few water bodies as they're listed as sort of the district managed lakes, but they have wetland classifications per the DNR.
Like Casey Lake, for instance.
Yes, Pig's Eye Lake, I think. So overall, your roles line up pretty well with the other organizations.
Forgive me, I got distracted. Did you describe what P means versus W?
Oh, sure. The designations in the public waters inventory, which is kind of the statewide inventory maintained by the Department of Natural Resources of streams and water basins, they call them. They are given a P or a W designation. P is generally what we refer to as a lake designation, and W is a wetland designation. Sometimes they can seem a little bit arbitrary in terms of what is designated as what. There are many things that people consider lakes in terms of how they view them on a daily basis, how they perceive them, and what they should bring to the community. They're viewed as lakes, but the state calls them a wetland.
And on the capital projects, is that we're not currently involved in capital projects with wetlands? Have we done them in the past?
So there's no specific projects outlined in our implementation schedule in our plan. That's to say it does allow, so it does talk about wetland restoration projects in our implementation plan. It's just nothing specific was laid out, but we have taken steps over the last several years to identify potential restoration site locations, and we did budget a couple of years back. So we do have some capital improvement funds available to do those projects.
That's kind of where I was curious about.
Yeah.
So because it's performed capital projects, that's why we didn't mark it, because I
Because
didn't think we were limited, but we
specifically,
don't have.
but we're not limited.
Yeah, so, yeah, that's the point I want to be.
Yeah.
We're not.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's.
We're not limited, no.
That's right. So starting with your rules, you've got pretty strong rules regarding wetland buffers. Those came up in some of the discussion earlier tonight about the permit reviews, and you guys seem pretty familiar with those. There's also the option for wetland bounce and inundation standards. And there's the piece of related to your project review and documentation. So as you noted with the permit review discussion earlier tonight, as part of the project review, you guys go through, as an organization, your staff goes through and looks at whether or not they are impacting wetlands in a way that is consistent with their functions and values and with the WACA regulations.
I should know this. But that top one, the wetland bounce and inundation standards. As you can quickly summarize.
That's coming up on the next
right
page
into
here.
Before you go to that, I can't recall which wetlands we're actively monitoring. In terms of
That
level.
is something we'll be considering for the future, so we don't have any active
That's what I was curious
wetland
about.
monitoring at this time.
Forgive me, so this is
Yeah.
more of just a revision to them and consideration. Thank you.
Yeah, these are kind of the three areas that we'll talk about as potential revisions to your roles.
Okay, good. Forgive me, I thought we had something for some reason, I was mistaken.
There has been some wetland.
There has
I-
been in the past.
I thought it was manual is what I was thinking. We don't have an automatic wetland level guides or.
We used to do some habitat monitoring of
Well, I understand.
some like key wetlands throughout the district. We also did some I'm trying to think of the right words, biomonitoring of some wetland areas, but we don't have an active monitoring program.
Thank you. Forgive me, continue. So starting with those bounce and inundation standards, this is something that Ramsey-Washington currently does not have explicitly within its rules. Some organizations do have these. The goal with these is to limit the hydrologic impacts to wetlands. And generally, they set performance standards that are triggered as part of a development review process. So similar to how your buffer standards are enforced. And they limit water level fluctuation on downstream wetlands. So wetlands that would receive runoff from a project. And they limit the fluctuation or bounce in the water level, and also the maximum of time that water levels can be elevated before they're drawn back down to kind of their normal water level, which is referred to as inundation. Oftentimes, those criteria vary by the wetland classification. So there may be standards that are more stringent for the higher quality wetlands and then less stringent for the lower quality wetlands. These rules, for example, are implemented by Valley Branch, South Washington, and then the Black Dog organization and Bassett Creek have an interesting approach in that their plans do not, and requirements documents do not specify numeric standards for these, but their plans state that their member cities must establish their own standards for these. So they don't necessarily set the number, but they say you have to have something like this.
And do we know, have their cities done something?
Yep. Yep, all of their cities are in compliance with their plans. So they do have these in place, and I'll show some examples in a moment. Such a requirement would align with your signs of success that wetlands are preserved and protected as measured by their net area and continued functions and values. So I mean, the intent here is that by limiting the hydrologic impacts, you would preserve their functions. And also aligns with your signs of success that priority natural areas are preserved, improved, and maintained. So these standards are really a maintenance or maintain, really about maintaining the existing quality of wetland. It's to prevent a detrimental impact.
Can you, or maybe Brandon, can speak a little bit to the difference between bounce and inundation versus rate control and kind of how they relate or don't relate, or?
What was the third thing, you know, that you say?
Rate control. So we have rate control requirements already, right, for wetlands. How does that relate, I guess, to bounce and inundation, or what would be the additional benefit, I guess, that we would receive?
I'll start, but Brandon's probably going to have to correct me. My understanding of rate control requirements are typically to prevent downstream flooding. In that specifically, they're looking so that you don't authorize a change that's going to be beyond the capacity of the downstream system or make things worse in terms of inundation of structures or infrastructure. With respect to the bounce and inundation, those standards are primarily targeting ecological factors. So with respect to bounce, you're thinking if those standards come from the Board of Water and Soil Resources, although they were never formally enacted as a state requirement. That's the origin of those standards. And they were typically developed to protect the ecological functions. So in terms of the drawdown period, for example, it's to try and minimize the amount of time that vegetation is submerged when it would otherwise not be submerged. Similarly with bounce, things like animal habitat and the different vegetation that's growing within the buffer areas, shoreline areas, to minimize those fluctuations, not from a public safety or infrastructure stability point of view, but more of an ecological function, versus the rate control, I believe, is primarily designed to protect infrastructure.
Yeah, I think in combination, those two requirements can work in concert to limit downstream changes. So if you think about balance is just the change in elevation. So if you have an upstream development that reduces runoff rates, well, now it's possible that your wetland doesn't bounce so as much, or it doesn't, it may even be lower because you're not getting that influx of water. And so if you have those two in combination, it can again, limit the change or impacts to that downstream water body.
I guess I'm curious too, just from a developer, let's say from a site design and developer's point of view, how much more does that put on them in their design? You know, I'm just curious how onerous of a requirement that might be for a few.
I think in practice, it depends.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on the size of the wetland, the tributary watershed to that wetland. It depends on what's being proposed. And so in some cases, I've seen developments very integrate that into their design process, and it's another box that they check. In other cases, I've seen that be the last hang up, that it's quite a bit of effort to check the box on that one. So it's not as clear as no problem or it's a spectrum.
I had a similar question. I was going to word it also in who owns it, but thinking back to the Hillcrest conversation where we had like they're doing 3 acres of wetlands there. I don't know how it changes their rules if we were to enact or update. I was curious on how do we communicate the return on investment for doing the inundation and bounce rules, kind of looking forward. What's the benefit to the end user or a builder? To just add to the question that I shared with you.
The Hillcrest site is an interesting one, particularly because of the mass grading, because of the contamination. The fact that they're going to have to restore the wetlands. Those wetlands may not, I haven't seen the plans, they may not be in the same location. So for a site like that, a bounce may not, this type of requirement may not be applicable.
Okay.
For a site like that.
So there will be further rules required, site-specific rules, depending on the wetland. Is that a fair conclusion?
If you were to move forward with that, that would be a process that we would include into our rule.
That's what
Yeah.
So this would have a ripple to another set of rules when we talk about permitting.
Yeah.
And it could have implication for wetlands within the footprint of a project area such as Hillcrest, or it could have implications for the drainage downstream, which sometimes those are the bigger issues because they're a project proponent developer is, they're all focused on their footprint, what they're going to do. And the downstream is, I don't care much, whereas maybe not property characterized, but
they have less control over.
They have less control.
Yeah.
Yes.
And just to continue that line of thinking in terms of, I'm curious what it does to us in terms of maintenance. So there definitely were wetlands when I first joined the board that had more water in them than they had in previous years, many years before. And so I don't know whose responsibility it would then be to ensure that maybe it met an inundation requirement. Does that fall to us to help alleviate?
So this wouldn't apply to, this would only apply to through our rules. So it only apply when new development was, or redevelopment was being.
Only new development or redevelopment?
Yeah.
Though, sorry, I forgot your name.
Greg.
It's Greg, it's when cities have been asked to adopt something, to push some responsibilities onto the cities.
Well, in the case of the WMOs, they don't have they can't have regulatory programs like ours, so rules. So they develop standards that they require the cities to implement. So it's a little bit different. These would be our
WMOs.
Yeah, because they're different.
The cities still only apply it as a development or redevelopment criteria versus bearing that responsibility themselves for maintaining the
And oftentimes those WMOs have representation on each of their member cities.
Each of their cities have, yeah.
Okay, so building on, so it's these rules are applied. Forgive me, Ben, if you had a question.
No, I'm just taking this all in right now.
He wasn't kidding. It's years and
No,
yes, first back and we got
just the amount of downstream effects this has and how you weed through all of that. It's a lot to digest, but I am following the conversation.
No, I apologize. I could keep asking questions all night as unfortunately Tina knows. I'm curious, thinking about they've done the development, they have balance and inundation rules, they will create BMPs to manage that balance and inundation. In an event of a flood where they can't meet those balance and inundation rules, what happens?
Nothing.
Okay,
So I mean, this is based on their site design, just like, let's say for water quality, they have to meet a water quality standard. If there were a flush of phosphorus, you know, there's nothing it's meant to a design standard essentially. So same with inundation. If there's a flood event, I mean, that's outside of the control of
right, that doesn't,
all.
well, they design to the 100, to our rules set forth in the development. I can't remember what the rules.
Yeah, I mean, there's, for rate control and.
Rate control, you set events and durations.
Thank you, that's.
I think that's probably more going back to the conversation about the difference between bounce and rate controls is probably more appropriately applied.
Yeah.
And the rate control side.
That makes sense.
And you haven't presented. So
Yeah.
maybe I shouldn't have I'll preload the question, the Apple Valley and Burnsville examples. Would you characterize those as more bounce controls or rate controls?
These ones are primarily bounce. And as you can see here, the way these standards are written right now, these examples up here, again, these are only written for 1, 2, and 10-year events. So with respect to, I won't say those are small events. I mean, those are still significant events, a 10-year event, but they're not written for the sort of the catastrophic, the 100-year event, the major floods, which are where you see a lot of your rate control requirements going up to those 100-year events. So this is really on the sort of smaller scale recurring event type of thing. Again, looking at more of those ecological factors to try and make sure that it's not going to be stressing the plants and animals that are kind of living there consistently, as opposed to kind of an event that you would have to recover from. And speaking to the rate control piece versus the bounce and inundation, we did review this as part of developing the Black Dog Watershed Management Plan. They just renewed their plan or updated their plan. And this was one of the things we specifically looked at to see, did it make sense to get rid of it or keep it? And one of the reasons to consider scrapping it was there was concern that it was overly burdensome on their member cities and developers. And the feedback that we got back specifically from Apple Valley was that in their experience, and again, this is very specific to each particular case, but in their experience was that if the development met their city's rate control standards, they were basically 90% of the way there with respect to the bounce and inundation piece. So there is a lot of symmetry between those requirements.
Could you help me understand what on the Burnsville side outlet control equals no change means?
Oh yeah, theirs is written such that basically the outlet elevation on the downstream wetland, they say you can't alter it, so you can't.
So this getting to some of the comments that Mark made earlier, they're more stringent on water that leaves the development area. Is that a fair conclusion?
In this case, this would not be, the outlet control is not related to the let me rephrase it. It would be applicable only in the case where they have an on-site wetland. So they can't alter the outlet elevation of the wetland itself.
Yeah, so it would apply to the basin of concern, basin within a footprint.
Okay.
So you can't take on more water. You can't raise it, and you're not lowering it. You maintain it, even though there are storms coming through.
Is it a safe? I don't want to jump to conclusions, but is it safe to say Burnsville has more stringent requirements than Apple Valley then? Or how should I consider comparing these two in pros and cons?
They're a little bit different. Apple Valley doesn't have the outlet control, but in some cases, like for the manage one, for Apple Valley calls it manage one, Burnsville calls it improve. Burnsville allows a higher bounce, but a shorter inundation period. So Okay. You know, a lot of these come out of that draft guidance that was developed by the Board of Water and Soil Resources, I believe in 2001. You know, if you Google it, you can only find it as a Word document because it never even really made it that far in the development phase. And that's those numbers are generally the basis for a lot of these standards, and there's a lot of similarity between the organizations that have these numbers, but they're not all super exact. And I don't really know why there are those minor differences. You know, like looking at the managed
Meaningful, I can't tell.
Apple Valley for managed 2, you know, they say the 10-year has to be drawn down within 14 days and Burnsville says 15 days. It's probably a transcription error over the course of the years. You know, I'm not sure what the meaningful difference is there.
And protect would be our A, 1 would be your B, and C would cover 2 and 3, and
Essentially,
yeah. And then for Apple Valley, for example, the managed 3, they essentially treat it like a stormwater pond. It's got, they're allowing 4 feet of ounce and 21 days to draw down. So they're looking at it as flood control, basically.
If I can just highlight something that you said earlier, Greg, in terms of a lot of these are set for like the 2-year or 10-year type event. It's those events are far more frequent. And so ecologically, they can have a much greater potential impact on the system. I mean, you get that 100-year or 5 or 1,000-year event that everything just gets, I mean, everything is ecologically kind of reset. But if you try to put some controls and some guidelines around the frequency and the controls around these frequent events, that you hopefully get somewhere.
Yeah. Like that. It's a good way to put it. Another piece of wetland requirement. So again, those are the inundation and bounce stuff. That's something that you would review as part of a project or development or redevelopment project. Similar to how the buffer standards are implemented, that's part of a development review process. Buffer standards, the goal here is that it provides permanent protections for wetlands. Your current buffer standards are quite strong, are pretty consistent with the others in the metro. One possible area where it could change is that you could require conservation easements for wetlands. Those could be limited to, or certain classifications or vary by classification. But again, it would be triggered by a development or redevelopment review. In terms of comparing to other organizations, everybody requires buffers, but right now, none of the watershed districts or WMOs are requiring conservation easements for the buffer area themselves.
Say more about what you mean by a conservation.
So a conservation easement being I believe it's some sort of documentation tied to the property ownership that limits what you can do in a particular area. Like I think a lot of folks have it for access to stormwater features and things like that. But in this case, it would be applied to the buffer area. It's just a little bit more teeth in terms of
a little bit more legal standing over time.
Yeah.
Would those just be blanket put on everything, or would that only happen with redevelopment? Do those have to go on by agreement? I mean, 'cause that's a big change from a property owner's or holder's standpoint.
Yeah, my understanding is that it would likely be triggered by a development or redevelopment project. So it'd be part of that project review and approval process where, you know, it would have to be essentially agreed to by everybody in order for that project to move forward.
But could they then vary by agreement and property owner, you know, if you're getting a lot of pushback and it's just a big hurdle for somebody?
In the same way that you as a board can grant variances to the minimum buffer requirements or anything like that.
I don't know what the value would be to enact that is where I'm struggling.
Yeah,
I'm not necessarily advocating for it. I just wanted to make you aware of it as an option for further protection of buffer areas.
occasionally our cities will have stricter requirements for buffers. For instance, City of Maple Woods restrictions are higher than ours, and in some cases they have asked for conservation easements. It's an ask, and if the landowner is willing to do that, then they would enter into those agreements, but yeah, again, I wouldn't be advocating either. It's just something we can talk about.
Another possible direction, just to pick up on what you haven't heard, that go possibly by classification. So earlier you went through those kinds of wetland, the deeper, more saturated or whatever. That would be another way to parse out some standards, because some wetlands have different sort of thresholds of tolerance compared to other wetlands. And the current method of manage ABC is more on kind of their integrity, sort of how high quality they are, and not necessarily the type of wetland.
Right. Yeah, it would be the quality, right?
Would it be possible to understand when us as a board can request conservation easements? Because that would be, what it feels to me is it's undue burden on developers is what I'm gathering from the conversation. But it might be a tool in cases where we want to stress the importance of those buffers. I just don't know when to ask.
Yeah, did we require that on Victoria Shores? Is that the name of it? Maybe Nicole, if you're available. I feel like either us or the city required the conservation easement on the buffer for the development along Wasso, like
I was going to
Wasso.
ask about the Owasso one.
And that was an ask because of the request to, access the lake through the buffer area and to have paths and, different items. And we wanted a little more teeth in that ability to make sure that that would be preserved as buffer. So I feel like that was something.
No, the only other
Yeah.
competition-
There was a
Go
a separate agreement for the wetland buffer, and the biggest part of that agreement was what you can't do in it.
So it wasn't a conservation easement, it was just an agreement around what would maintenance. Of the
Yeah,
buffer.
preservation really. So I guess in some ways it's the same, but it was more meant to regulate activities within the buffer.
I feel like an agreement is an easier
Mhm.
thing to navigate than a conservation easement. Once you start to say easement, a property owner is gonna look at that as like taking away from their property. Just in my mind anyways, and if you say, hey, we want to come to an agreement about how to maintain and keep this buffer intact for the health of the wetland, that's like, we're working in partnership. In my mind.
I think that's fair. It feels like it's
Yeah.
a tool that I just don't know a lot about. Agreement does seem like a win-win type of direction for sure. I apologize.
If I could chime in, I've done some conservation easements for the Valley Branch Watershed District under pretty unique circumstances, but I will agree that landowners really balk at the sound of an easement and can create a difficult working relationship. And because their easements are recorded ongoing, it's ongoing against the property. Usually they need to be paid for. So you're actually purchasing a property interest in the land if you have a conservation easement. So just some things to keep in mind. They are good tools and they're really good for regulating activities, but I think more informal agreements sometimes get you further. It's kind of a attracting more with sugar kind of thing.
Thanks, Lauren.
I think our signage requirements to help get at that as well are buffer monuments. We require like signs placed at specific intervals to really demarcate that line for, when properties change hands and things like that.
Just that your buffer standards, it's pretty clear they align with your goals as related to wetland management. This is just a brief summary of how yours align with the other organizations. Again, they're stronger than some, pretty consistent with many. I think Valley Branch has a little bit higher, but also they're not as developed as you are. So
That's what I was gonna ask about. What is the big driver?
I think that's the big difference, especially with and then South Washington has these, they're area triggered, so theirs are consistent with yours unless the wetland is more than an acre in size, and then they each get a 25-foot bump. But given that overall, though, I think your buffer widths are consistent and pretty strong, so I have no recommendation that you would mess with those.
It does seem like we're gonna get more requests as areas kind of in our northern part are getting further developed. At least it's what it feels like.
Redevelopment or-
Redevelopment.
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, I mean, certainly of the sites that are left for developments, they all have wetlands on them. And a lot of the tougher redevelopment sites would be because of wetland placement as well.
That brings us to wetland monitoring. Here, the goal would be to identify or quantify wetland impacts. There could be different types of monitoring. You could monitor reference wetlands. So that's a wetland that you don't expect to be impacted, to try and see changes over time that might be due to climate cycles or other kind of just, I don't want to say natural changes, but things like that, versus monitoring of impacted wetlands or suspected impacts to wetlands to see if there are things that you expect to be impacting wetlands and what impacts those have on the quality. Things that you might monitor would include like the hydrology, plants, macrophytes, macroinvertebrates, and then those MinRam functions and values. As was mentioned earlier, currently Ramsey-Washington does not have kind of a regular wetland monitoring program. And honestly, very few organizations do. Capital Region Watershed District does, and I think part of that is based solely on the fact of how few quality wetlands remain within their jurisdiction. So
I think they have 12 wetlands.
And
that
not
they-
one for lakes either.
And we're up close to 1,000, so that's, so the last time we did our MinRam functions and values. Oh gosh. I should have looked that up.
It's 2003 to 2005.
For the main part of our district, the Grass Lake WMO area that was added, that was done in 2013 or 14. But yes, the rest of it was early 2000s. At some point since then, I want to say in like 2010, we did do MinRam. We picked some reference wetlands throughout the watershed to see if there were changes in MinRam assessment, and there weren't significant changes. So we determined at that point not to do a full reassessment. That is something we could do again, as part of this, pick or look at those reference wetlands again to see if there's any significant shifting in quality without having to do the whole 1,000 wetlands.
I was gonna ask because we've had practices where we rotate, we don't do all of them all the time, right? Just checking, not so much wetlands, but for other mechanisms like inspections, we inspect everything, but we go.
Yeah.
I mean, so we don't have one now. It doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense to do a wetland check every year on every wetland. That seems cost prohibitive for sure, but maybe there's some sort of rotational mechanism we can leverage.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I would add to that, I heard from a Bowser employee, I think within the last couple of years, that they're looking to move away from MinRam and looking at a different assessment protocol. I think maybe with the DNR, but I don't recall specifically. So I would just, maybe you'd not want to do a full district-wide MinRam if the best practices are kind of moving away from that specific assessment.
Yeah, just follow on to what Nicole said. There is an effort going on between Minnesota and Wisconsin, and it's mainly a joint effort in Minnesota, a joint effort between DNR, Bowser, and PCA has some presence to come up with a new functional assessment methodology.
Okay.
And it's probably a year and a half to 2 years.
Okay. Yeah.
It's available.
What I liked about it was.
Thanks,
the other-
Mark.
Yeah. I owed you, Nicole.
I mean, it seems like could be benefit for planning out if we were to do capital projects, having something like that. I just don't, it just doesn't seem feasible to it very, very, very frequently.
No,
for a large
no.
city.
No, and I mean, to be honest, the wetlands don't change that quickly either, right? It takes some time to show any significant changes in quality.
Maybe there's something that we can discuss as a trigger to cause us to look at a wetland for an inspection. Maybe that's, instead of saying, hey, we're gonna inspect all the time, well, here's actually the trigger that we'll use. Maybe that might be another way to look at it.
Yeah, I like having the idea of having like reference or, certain wetlands that we're tracking over
Yeah.
time, because that helps maybe paint a picture of
Yeah,
that.
let's get some history.
Yeah. But,
I'd be
I
comfortable
will-
either.
yeah, go ahead, Nicole.
There is a provision too in our rules if there's a developer or landowner that thinks that our assessment is way off, that there's a process for them to challenge that. And it would involve them doing a new MinRam assessment, and we would review that information. So there is also that for permit applicants available to them.
That's
We've
also
seen
true.
a few of them come through as permits.
Yeah, that's also true if we didn't have a MinRam assessment on a wetland, if there was not detected or that would also be the case.
And just this one is related to that sign of success, that monitoring and research data are used to inform your district projects and programs. And district data are shared to contribute to the science of ecological restoration. So it does align with your purposes. And then coming lastly to this wetland restoration, the goal here to increase the quality and quantity of wetlands. The idea is that would be pursued as part of the intrinsic benefit and not as part of a compensatory mitigation effort. And those benefits being benefits to water quality, ecological benefits, and flood risk reduction / resiliency. I do want to point out the organizations here that do these. In the case of the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District, their wetland restorations are specifically tied to TMDL pollutant load reduction. So they're in pursuit of a specific water quality benefit from those versus kind of a more of a ecological value piece. And you do have priority sites that have been identified as part of that prior wetland restoration site study.
I know at a previous workshop, we talked about the role that banking plays and how we had also discussed around, does it make sense for us to put money toward or have people put money toward restorations in other areas? I recall, I don't remember the full depth of the conversation, but I remember those came up a couple of times. How does this relate to, I'm sorry, the day's getting long. How does this particular restoration relate to capital projects? Is this only for build sites, or is this something that could be more broadly applicable?
This would be for projects that we would pursue and
what I
identify
wanted.
to restore either previously drained or previously impacted wetlands. So that priority site identification study that was done looked at areas that had previous wetlands that no longer have wetlands on them, and then also at sites that have been heavily impacted over time. And those would be things that we would pursue and pay for, be capital projects of our own that we would implement.
And the reason I referenced the bank and thinking back to some of the conversations that we've had earlier today, if we had a mechanism where they said, look, we're going to impact the permanently here, is there ways for them to assist us in restoring wetlands through some sort of funding mechanism or et cetera?
So that's kind of twofold, I guess, a little bit, but so there's the Wetland Conservation Act rules require replacement, right?
Yes.
And in that case, no, you know, they couldn't just pay us because we wouldn't be able to do sites. Well, I don't think we would want to be in the business of restoring sites so that developers could impact wetlands, right? That feels a little counterintuitive. And we didn't identify sites that were large enough to be official Bowser banking sites.
I do remember that conversation.
So that was the first thing we said, no, we're not going to be able to, you know, create a Bowser wetland bank where they would have credits in our watershed to purchase.
One thing to, go ahead, you go first. One thing to bring up, and I'm not sure how ripe of a opportunity, but if we were to undertake some capital projects, and there are, I think, ample opportunities to improve some wetland quality within the district. There are provisions under WACA that you can get some potential gain as a bank site. It's certainly not anywhere near a 1-to-1. I think it's like a 10%. You know, so it's not terribly attractive. I think there's better reasons to put resources into upgrading wetland quality, but just so it's on the table, people are aware of it.
Yeah. So I was wondering, and there's probably a lot of background on this, but to me, the capital projects stick out. The water quality piece really sticks out because, you know, wetlands are great at producing water quality. But also looking holistically as a district at the water quality that we emit, which I say goes to Mississippi, we're a regional player, you know, there's further complications. How much, you know, has been put into the thought of, you know, introducing more of kind of the underground filters at inflows and outflows? There's vast areas of the district where we know there were wetlands at one time and now they're impervious deserts, and how we improve water quality in those areas that are flowing through the district. I mean, there's just a lot of moving parts. I don't know how far ranging this discussion has gone, if it's all just been based on wetland health and quality or more of a district water quality health.
I mean, we certainly all the rest of our capital improvement funds essentially go toward water quality projects, right? And so that's all assessed through our priority areas, TMDL requirements, and our target retrofits, and our stewardship grant program, and our permit program too, right? So all those things are what builds our water quality program. While wetland restoration certainly would enhance that, it's not going to be our primary tool for achieving our water quality goals. And so I believe we would look at it more from an ecological restoration potential, you know, and also the flood risk reduction resiliency kind of, especially when we're creating wetlands again, where there used to be wetlands where we don't have them now. That would be the primary goal of a capital improvement project that would focus on wetland restoration.
And how would we rank that in comparison to like a targeted fund, or is that something that we would need to dive into in our next 10-year goal and plan?
So I would say that, as I mentioned, the board in previous years has already allocated funds towards wetland restoration. So that's something that on a year-to-year basis, as we're evaluating our budget and we say, you know, here's our water quality projects, here's wetland restoration, here's natural resources restoration, you know, like those are all the things you evaluate on a work plan year to year, and evaluate now. And that then, yes, comes into play when you're determining if you're going to increase your budget or keep it stable, and what can we accomplish in that with those dollar amounts. So that is something that we evaluate on year to year. I do think that if the board wanted to be stronger in wetland restoration, that should be built into our next generation plan, or even an amendment to our current plan, if that, you know, if the board feels strongly about making that a higher priority, then I think that would be worthwhile to do an amendment so that it would, I mean, we're still 5 years, I think, from our, no, 2027, right? Yeah. So that's only 4 years.
Let's say.
So we'll actually start next year. So we'll actually start looking at our revision to our watershed management plan next year, and then yeah, we can build that in to be a stronger reference, I guess, or priority.
And is that something that BAR can look at, cost benefit analysis of restoring a wetland versus dissolved solids and, you know, the targeted funds, looking at those, you know, so we can kind of see like what's the benefit of restoring this wetland versus what's the benefit of this targeted capital project on water quality.
I mean, they can certainly do that, but again, they're not going to match up, right? So you're not going to get, so it's not an apples to apples, I would say. It's you know, we have priority A and we have priority B.
Yeah.
What kind of funds, you know, for instance, we might put $2 million into water quality improvements, and we have, you know, $3 million or $4 million in flood, you know, control projects, and then we have 100,000 for wetlands. So that's how you kind of set that.
Yeah, I know it's not the
priority.
same, it's just nice to see some quantitative information versus qualitative, you know, wetlands, beautiful. It's very easy to visualize versus, you know, something like an Arbogast filter, you don't see it. It'd just be nice to.
Every time we bring a project forward, whether it be water quality or wetland restoration, it would go through our prioritization tool, so you would see that. So you would have some of those factors all laid out, and for instance, it would be a higher natural resources benefit instead of water quality, you know, you just have different benefits. But yeah, that definitely, then you can compare, you can look at that. It wouldn't be competing for the same dollar or the same benefits, I guess.
And that's why I wanted to pull these up on the screen here, because you do have signs of success that are specifically targeting kind of the ecological and natural area piece that aren't specifically tied to the water quality benefit.
I don't know, Bill, if you're still on or not. I wouldn't want to take some of your turf or some of your past successes. But there have been capital projects that have been done in the past. I'm thinking the wetland in Grass Lake area, there was, you know, plantings and regrading. There's all the restoration work that was done with Keller, that's all wetland related. There's been some early work that I think Bill worked with researchers at the University of Minnesota to explore methods to control canary grass. You know, what would it take? That was done in the Urban Ecology Center, as well as a couple other. So I mean, there have been some capital.
Absolutely, actually, and the difference is they haven't gone through our capital improvements, they've gone through our program money. So so they go through our natural resource restoration project money, but it's kind of splitting hairs. I think you're right, we have done a lot of work in wetland restoration.
And most of those have largely been justified on more of the ecological value than necessarily the water quality.
Absolutely.
When I do know that in prior conversations, this particular area around when to do it is something that we absolutely have discussed, and definitely would be helpful to get some clarity around. I know our next step is to go into giving those type of conversation. Can I just pause really quick and ask Tina, we have 2 other new reports and presentations, or at least 3 conversations that took much longer than we anticipated. How do we how do we talk about tabling things versus?
So the other 2 items here are scope summaries, right, both of them. So they're not, there's no presentation. It was just for your information. Here's what we said we would do. Here's how we're moving forward. Here's the scope, schedule, budget for that.
Okay, so then if there are no questions on B and C, we can move forward with them, but if there are questions, can we push a discussion for next month?
Yeah, absolutely. I would just say that, you know, we're actively working those, we'll be actively working.
For our information,
if you
need approval.
Right, that's correct. And then, you know, anything under the admin or project status report is for information as well. So if there are questions that you have, we can quickly do them, or you can get in touch with me outside of the meeting. So.
And if there's something that merits a conversation, we'll bring it up for next time. Okay, I just wanted to be very clear. I'm trying to stay conscious of the time. Because I know we all
Lots
have
of
other
good
jobs.
discussion. Yes.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, so that brings us to sort of the culmination of this discussion here, is that the purpose of this presentation was to kind of lay out what some of the options are relative to what you do right now, and just kind of get your gut check reaction to them. Do these seem like good ideas, things that you want to pass on, things that might be a good idea depending upon how it's structured, and to that end, I've suggested choosing this very quantitative and highly detailed
Yes.
thumbs up, thumbs sideways, thumbs down option with respect to some of the things that we've talked about, to just kind of get your ideas about whether it's a good idea, might be a good idea, or no, it's a terrible idea. And specifically thinking back to something like bounce and inundation standards, any changes to your buffer standards. We kind of glossed over this, but there was earlier in the discussion, we talked about project review and documentation. It came up over the course of doing this exercise that some of this review is already kind of built into the project review process, and it may just not be explicitly documented. So we were thinking about whether or not it made sense to revisit how that information is presented. Wouldn't be any changes to your rules, but potentially being more explicit about why issues became issues or did not become issues in terms of the documentation of the review process.
Also applying to our own projects, not just permitted projects, but the work that we're doing on project sites as well.
I was going to ask, would this amount to another checkbox that Nicole would put in her permit process that is something that they triggered or looked into?
Okay.
Something like that. Okay.
So specifically those three elements related to the rules, whether it makes sense to consider some sort of monitoring or assessment program, and then whether it makes sense to beef up or structure to better structure your capital improvement program to incorporate those wetland improvements. I'll say, based on the discussion thus far, I feel like we've got, everybody seems pretty good on what we've got right now in terms of the buffer standards. So I would maybe propose taking that one off the table, but how do you guys feel about the other ones?
I mean, it's been shown that cities can be stricter than us on that one, so I'm okay with that.
I'm comfortable with the buffer standards because they're still up to our discretion. We're going to have discussions as we go. How about the wetland balance and inundation standards? I know this is something I'm interested in because I think having that regulation of wetlands, I think, will overall help the system, in my opinion. So I would love to see kind of what would be the best cost benefit for our wetlands. But what do y'all think?
I would agree with those statements. I would want to see specifics and what those implications would be.
Yeah, because I don't think it's as simple as saying Apple Valley, we're taking that one.
No.
No.
Yeah, no, we would definitely, so the next step would be to bring back some sort of evaluation of what that would look like, what a potential revision would mean, and the implications. So what does that mean for our developers? And from there, then if you were interested in including that in a rule, it would need to go through a bigger rule revision process, right? So that would just be the board's interested in this. And then we would work with our rules technical evaluation, technical advisory committee, as well as Capital Region Watershed District, who we collaborate with our rules on, to go through a rule revision process. But that's a long-term, I would say, solution.
And would probably touch into the next revision of the plan as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Really, any of these, it would be us bringing back more information for you to keep advancing it, I guess. Same with the wetland monitoring and the wetland restoration work as well.
Yeah, I would certainly support the wetland bounce standards. I would see value in wetland restoration projects as well. I think there's some potential, especially in kind of the enhancement. In the monitoring, sure. But
Yep.
I have to say, yeah.
So
no,
thumbs up for
there'd be
now.
value.
To at least keep bringing more information to you on that.
I'm definitely aligned with Mark's conclusion where it's like thumbs up. I'm interested in review documentation. We table that the wetland monitoring and restoration projects. I could thumbs up for more information. I'm also interested in. So this is a lot of the rules are focused on the redevelopment and deployment, and the rest of them are for our wetlands generally. I know that there's always concerns about like what happens when wetlands are holding more water than they had historically, or at least in the recent path. So the monitoring one seems good, but it should be purposeful and not overly burdensome.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very, I think that's well stated. I mean, monitoring could go in all sorts of directions.
It totally
It would need to be very intentional.
Intentional and action driven is really what I want to. The review documentation, that in my mind, and forgive me if I'm oversimplifying it, seems like it just could be a quick run around of like, hey, this is what we do, and maybe capture it separately and let us know. It doesn't feel like, I think that would be good, even as a refresher for me. Nicole, I've only went through hard knocks through Nicole, asking her questions, learning where things are at, but that makes sense.
Okay.
I don't know how others feel on that.
To me, the project review and documentation, and it would be good to have staff input, but it seems like, pardon the pun, but it might almost be a way of getting our ducks in the row or in terms of understanding some of our current processes and then feed that into particularly the bounce and inundation standards.
Yeah, maybe tie it together with that one. You know, if you think there's extra clarity that could be added to the summaries, you know, totally open for that. But I think that's an optimization that staff could choose to move forward with. It would help inform us. This is really good. I have other questions, so I assume we'll come back with this, and I could maybe add to discussions later other questions.
I think so. I think, I mean, how I would see this moving forward is maybe we would pick one of these items and bring it back to a future board meeting, kind of one at a time.
Yeah.
I do think you're right that this ties in, you know, mostly with our next generation planning too, so we can, you know, have our ducks in a row, as you said, as we move into that process. That seems.
So one caveat with the restoration projects, I just want to throw in the maintenance component is really critical because these wetlands are constantly being assaulted by weed invasion.
Yeah.
So it's not a one and done thing. So the board has to know that on the front end and be willing to commit to long-term maintenance when they get into these wetland restoration projects.
Yeah, I think so.
So that would be another thing that we would bake into when we, for example, selected our maintenance groups. That would be one of the items in there.
Yeah.
It would just be unique.
It could be.
Okay.
Yeah, it could be
just
part of
depends
that.
on it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it almost ties to the water quality and inspection piece, because if it's doing good one year and you don't have much to do, in another year or two, you could have a lot of work to do to maintain that well in the ecosystem.
That's a good point.
So I mean, it's kind of all interplaced together.
Yeah, typically what we're seeing is year 2 and 3 are pretty high maintenance output, and then it gradually declines over a 10-year period. In year 2 and 3, you're looking at about 3 to 5% of the total project cost. And then after that, it drops to 1 to 2% on an annual basis, roughly.
That'd be a good pros and cons table when that comes back up. But just in the interest of time, if there's no further questions on that part, thank you so much, Greg. Thank you. And the presentation was really easy to read, and thank you. I'm gonna kind of blanket ask on agenda topics 10B and C. Are there questions for Brandon? He waited patiently through this, and we're going to let him off easy. I'm just kidding.
So those are the two scope summaries. If you didn't have any questions. More to cut, you'll see more on that in the future as well.
Thank you for answering the one question I did have, which is, did it need an action? Answer's no.
No.
Moving on to the administrator's report, is there anything worth mentioning as a quick highlight?
Well, since Bill is on the line here, and just will highlight again that his resigning and retirement from the Watertown district is coming quickly. We'll notify you of a date for his retirement. I don't know. What are we calling it? Can't remember his. Not a
I
retirement.
don't know, I don't know what it's called. Moving on, how about that? Moving on.
But we'll.
The sunrise, you won't have to do the early morning anymore.
I'll still be getting up pretty early, Mark, unfortunately.
It's talking geographic terms.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
I saw that it huge shoes to fill there.
Yeah, it's big changes coming, but we're prepared to move forward with those. So, the other thing I would just mention, it's not in the packet, but I did tell Val that I am not going to be here next month. It's not working out for moving our daughter out of college, so we're gonna need to be on the road driving on Wednesday in May. Paige will be here to help lead the meeting with you all, and she'll be prepared to answer all the questions you may have. Or at least come back with the answers. So just want to let you know that.
I don't have any questions. There's seismic changes coming to your board, and I'm glad you're the leader helping it through. It makes a lot of sense what you're trying to do. Any further questions for Tina on the administrative report? On the action items, I had some questions, but they don't merit a need tonight. We can talk about them next month. We won't impact the conclusions there. Any questions on the projects and program status? We've already talked about 12A. Thank you, Brandon, for talking with us on that.
Nope, I looked at everything and I'm at the end of my question.
Yeah, thank you very much for updating the story map.
Yeah.
Found myself peeking at it at work.
Yes.
Resource.
Yeah, a lot of good information on there and can help answer a lot of questions.
Last is manager comments. In next month's meeting, I would propose that if you need to see anything for next month, please let myself or Tina know. And then can I have a motion to adjourn?
I motion for adjournment.
Second.
All those in favor?
All in favor?
Aye.
Awesome, thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Yep.
Thank you.
Bye.